What if everything you believe is a lie? What if your life is just running away from yourself? Søren Kierkegaard, a man who peered into the deepest abyss of human existence, asked questions impossible to simply brush aside. He offered no consolation. He gave no ready-made answers. He tore away the masks from what we call normal life and revealed the despair, fear, and emptiness hidden beneath. You live in a world where everyone seems happy, where religion is just a tradition and faith is merely a checkbox on a form. But Kierkegaard shouts, "It's all an illusion." The crowd drags you down, society trains you into conformity, and the church offers comfort instead of truth. But there's another path, a path of solitude, anxiety, and genuine freedom, a path where you encounter God not through rituals, but through a leap of faith, into an abyss where there are no guarantees, where reason is powerless, where only you and eternity remain. This philosophy changed the world. It gave birth to existentialism, psychology, and the modern understanding of the individual. Get comfortable, because ahead of you awaits the most comprehensive breakdown of Søren Kierkegaard's philosophy. And before you start watching, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin. Part 1. Time, Eternity, and the Moment, where the finite encounters the infinite. Søren Kierkegaard crafted a profound and distinctive understanding of time, showing how human existence can intersect with eternal meaning. Rather than viewing time as a mere sequence of quantifiable units, he introduced the idea of existential time, a deeply subjective experience shaped by personal decisions, moments of self-awareness, and encounters with the eternal. His philosophy illuminates how finite human life can be infused with infinite significance. For Kierkegaard, the present is not simply one point among many. It becomes the decisive arena for living authentically. To fully engage with his religious and philosophical vision, one must grasp how he weaves together the concepts of time, eternity, and the transformative nature of the moment. Kierkegaard distinguished between several dimensions of time, each corresponding to a different mode of existence. At the most basic level lies chronological time, a linear flow from past to present to future. This is the time of nature, biology, and historical progression. It is also the domain of the aesthetic way of life, where individuals experience time as something to be consumed, escaped, or manipulated for novelty and entertainment. For those living aesthetically, time becomes burdensome, a void to be filled with fleeting experiences, distractions, and surface-level pleasures. It carries no enduring direction and lacks any connection to lasting significance. In contrast, ethical time arises in a life shaped by responsibility, purpose, and moral engagement. Here, time takes on substance and coherence, organized around duties, relationships, and social obligations. Individuals living ethically perceive time as the field in which they fulfill promises, contribute to society, and uphold enduring values. This ethical experience of time offers more weight and structure than the aesthetic, lending a sense of direction. However, it remains confined within human finitude. While it introduces meaning, it does not transcend temporal limitations. Kierkegaard's concept of religious time marks a fundamental departure from both aesthetic and ethical perspectives. Within this sphere, time becomes the meeting place of the temporal and the eternal. The crucial element here is the moment, a singular point where human existence is elevated beyond the finite. In such moments, the individual becomes aware of their eternal significance, even as they remain rooted in the temporal world. These moments are not governed by linear causality. They are charged with transcendent consequence. From this viewpoint, time is no longer simply a backdrop or a measure. It becomes the very medium in which decisions of ultimate importance are made. Central to Kierkegaard's thought is the moment as the intersection of eternity and time, where the individual faces the possibility of living with true inward commitment. The religious individual differs fundamentally from both the aesthetic and ethical person. While the aesthetic individual floats through a series of ever-changing moments, and the ethical person is bound by duty and consistency, the religious individual experiences the moment as a threshold into eternity. In such instances, time itself is infused with infinite meaning. These are not ordinary episodes. They are sacred encounters where the self meets what is eternally significant. Kierkegaard believed this understanding of the moment found its clearest expression in the Christian belief in the Incarnation. The claim that the eternal God entered into temporal existence as a human being, Jesus Christ, is, for Kierkegaard, the ultimate paradox and the core of Christian faith. It represents the astonishing idea that the infinite can inhabit the finite without dissolving it, and that eternity can break into history without erasing time. This divine incarnation serves as a paradigm for how human beings, through particular and decisive moments, can participate in eternal reality. It affirms the possibility that individual moments can hold infinite value. Another cornerstone of Kierkegaard's temporal philosophy is his concept of repetition. Unlike recollection, which looks backward in an attempt to relive or retrieve the past, repetition involves a forward-facing return. It preserves what is essential from past experiences while allowing for renewal and progression. Repetition becomes a way to remain faithful to one's deepest commitments without becoming static. Through repetition, the self avoids both meaningless flux and lifeless rigidity. Kierkegaard saw it as a way in which the eternal is present within time, not as a fixed relic, but as a living, dynamic force. It is not about nostalgia or novelty, but about continually returning to what truly matters with fresh engagement. This form of repetition stands in stark contrast to both aesthetic and ethical time. The aesthetic individual, constantly chasing newness, ends up trapped in shallow cycles of meaningless repetition. The ethical person, in adhering to fixed norms, may fall into mechanical routines devoid of renewed personal meaning. Religious repetition, however, involves a conscious and ever-deepening recommitment. It is not born of habit, but of faith. Each return is an intentional act of renewal. Rather than diminishing over time, such repetition gains strength, becoming more potent with each iteration. Kierkegaard delves into the concept of repetition by examining the biblical figure of Job, whom he presents as the knight of faith, a person who regains what was lost through a deeply spiritual return. Job endures the devastation of all he values, but never abandons his foundational relationship with God. His restoration is not a simple reward or compensation. It is the fruit of a faith that has endured and been profoundly refined. Repetition, in this light, does not signify a literal return to the past, but rather the reception of what is vital, renewed, and transfigured. For the faithful individual, repetition unfolds as the persistent renewal of their connection to the eternal amidst the shifting conditions of temporal existence. Kierkegaard emphasizes the centrality of the present moment, asserting that it is only in the now that true decisions and lasting commitments can be made. The past cannot be altered, and the future remains concealed. Only the present offers the space where authentic acts with eternal significance can arise. This attention to the present underlines Kierkegaard's broader concern with personal responsibility and deliberate choice, distancing his thought from detached speculation or passive doctrinal adherence. However, not every moment qualifies as authentic within Kierkegaard's view. Much of life is consumed by fleeting concerns and superficial aims, devoid of the existential depth that stems from genuine engagement with the eternal. An authentic moment arises when an individual becomes fully conscious of the gravity of their choices and dedicates themselves without reservation to what they perceive as meaningful and true. These moments are transformative. They extend their influence beyond the decision itself, reshaping how one interprets past experiences and opening new horizons for future action. In Kierkegaard's exploration of anxiety, he reveals that our temporal condition makes such transformation possible. Anxiety emerges from our recognition of freedom, the unsettling awareness that we must choose our path without any guarantee of the outcome. This absence of certainty is what makes genuine choice possible. If our lives were predetermined, or if we possessed complete foresight, then real decisions would be impossible. There would be no ambiguity, no real alternatives. This tension between time and eternity thus becomes a cornerstone of Kierkegaard's understanding of human life. In contrast to thinkers who perceive history as a rational, linear development governed by logical necessity, Kierkegaard insists on its unpredictability and discontinuity. Every moment in history harbors the potential for something radically new, possibilities that cannot be deduced from prior events or abstract principles. History, therefore, is not a mechanical progression of inevitabilities, but a realm open to innovation and meaningful human action. This temporal understanding reorients how we view identity and life planning. Instead of seeing themselves as fixed beings with predetermined paths, individuals must recognize that they are constantly shaping themselves through their choices in time. This recognition reveals both a vast potential and a profound responsibility. Each significant decision unfolds at the intersection of the temporal and the eternal, participating in the ongoing formation of the self and the deeper meaning of existence. Kierkegaard uses this interplay to challenge both worldly ambition and spiritual escapism. Those who pursue only temporal success fail to perceive the eternal significance that gives depth to achievement. Conversely, those who attempt to withdraw entirely from the world in pursuit of pure spiritual transcendence overlook the crucial fact that time is the very medium through which eternal meaning becomes real. True existence for Kierkegaard lies in embracing both the finite and the infinite. It requires uncovering the eternal within the boundaries of temporal life, not fleeing from limitation, but finding profound significance within it. To live authentically is to engage the world of time with the perspective of eternity, allowing each passing moment to bear the weight of ultimate meaning. Part 2. Sin and guilt, the religious dimensions of human existence. Kierkegaard's treatment of sin ranks among the most significant elements of his examination of what it means to be human. Rather than approaching sin through conventional moral perspectives, he presents it as a profound spiritual disorder, not merely an ethical lapse, but a disruption at the very heart of the self's relation to both itself and to God. His seminal works, The Concept of Anxiety and the Sickness unto Death, explore this concept in depth, depicting sin as a fracture in the structure of selfhood. To comprehend Kierkegaard's concept of sin is to see why he insists that religious understanding is essential for interpreting human life. While ethical systems and psychological theories may offer valuable insights, Kierkegaard maintains that they lack the depth to fully express the weight and significance that sin carries within the inner life of the individual. In his framework, sin is a universal component of the human condition, but one that crucially depends on personal freedom and individual responsibility. Kierkegaard differentiates between sin as interpreted by psychology, which might identify its manifestations or symptoms, and sin as a religious phenomenon grounded in humanity's estrangement from the divine. While psychological analysis can describe patterns of behavior or emotional turmoil, it cannot penetrate the essential truth of separation from God. Kierkegaard insists that sin is not the result of external causes or prior conditions. Like freedom, it exists as part of the very makeup of human existence. Both are grounded in the self's capacity for reflection and choice. Neither biology nor environment gives rise to sin or freedom. Instead, they are rooted in the existential nature of being human, beings who are aware of themselves and responsible for their actions. A key part of Kierkegaard's thinking is his reimagining of the concept of hereditary sin. He does not accept the traditional theological claim that humanity inherits guilt directly from Adam's original transgression. Rather than viewing it as a literal transmission of blame, Kierkegaard presents hereditary sin as the existential condition of being born into a world already steeped in sin. This context precedes and influences every individual's life, but does not negate personal responsibility. Even within this inherited framework, each person must commit their own decisive act of sin. Kierkegaard describes this as a qualitative leap, a voluntary move by which the individual consciously enters into sin. In this way, sin is at once a shared human predicament and a deeply personal moral decision. This dual nature affirms both the universality of sin and the necessity of individual accountability. Kierkegaard's exploration begins with a portrayal of innocence, the pre-moral stage of human life, existing before the awareness of good and evil arises. He characterizes this state as one of ignorance, where the self has not yet formed a moral identity and is untouched by ethical judgment. However, even this innocence is not without tension. It is haunted by anxiety, the existential signal that freedom is drawing near. In Kierkegaard's account, anxiety is not itself a form of sin, but a natural expression of the self's confrontation with its own potential. It reflects the disorienting sense that comes when a person realizes the limitless scope of choice and moral responsibility. Anxiety, then, is the soul's anticipation of freedom, the inner vertigo that emerges when facing the reality of self-determination. Sin enters the picture when the self attempts to establish its identity apart from its divine origin. The individual moves away from grounding itself in God, seeking instead to root its existence in finite realities, things of the temporal world. This act of turning away from the infinite and attempting self-sufficiency marks the essence of sin. It is not simply disobedience, but a deeper rejection of the self's dependency on its Creator. For Kierkegaard, the origin of sin is not external temptation, but the inner workings of human freedom confronting possibility. He distinguishes between sin as a state, a distortion of being, and individual sins, which are particular actions that reflect that condition. Every person's first act of sin mirrors the biblical fall of Adam. It represents the moment when innocence is abandoned through the conscious misuse of freedom, an intentional step away from alignment with divine will. This transition brings the self into a new condition that Kierkegaard calls the anxiety of sin, where the soul becomes increasingly vulnerable to further wrongdoing. What Kierkegaard considers the most devastating effect of sin is not punishment imposed from the outside, but the way sin reproduces itself within the self. Each act of sin intensifies the separation from God, undermines the clarity of moral choice, and accelerates the descent into despair. Sin becomes a self-perpetuating condition, a downward spiral where alienation deepens, freedom weakens, and spiritual blindness increases. Kierkegaard's analysis of this process is marked by an extraordinary depth of both psychological and theological insight. Sin leads to a profound loss of personal freedom, drawing individuals into patterns of self-deception and spiritual blindness. What begins as the daunting weight of existential freedom slowly gives way to a growing fear tied to one's sinful state. As awareness of this condition deepens, so does the anxiety, reinforcing the sense of being trapped in a cycle of moral failure. Sin becomes an internal torment, a relentless loop of guilt, self-reproach, and continued wrongdoing that feels nearly impossible to escape. At the heart of Kierkegaard's understanding of sin is the concept of guilt, though not in the ordinary psychological or societal sense. For him, guilt signifies a profound existential awareness of a broken relationship with God and a disconnection from one's true self. This is not a condition that can be resolved through personal effort, social change, or psychological healing, though these may offer temporary relief. Instead, this kind of guilt reveals a need that only divine forgiveness and grace can truly address. Kierkegaard's critique highlights the insufficiency of purely ethical responses to human suffering. While ethical reasoning can help clarify moral duties and encourage better choices, it cannot heal the spiritual rupture that lies at the heart of sin. A person may live by moral standards and still remain profoundly alienated from both God and their authentic self. This is why Kierkegaard elevates the religious stage above the ethical one. It confronts the underlying despair, not just its outward symptoms. In Kierkegaard's thought, the link between sin and freedom is deeply paradoxical. Sin originates from the human capacity for free choice, yet it ultimately erodes that very freedom. People can choose to sin, but once they do, the power of sin begins to limit their ability to choose rightly and to grow spiritually. This paradox underscores Kierkegaard's claim that human effort alone cannot overcome sin. What is required instead is a leap of faith, an act that opens the person to divine grace and the possibility of genuine transformation. Kierkegaard also explores how sin interacts with self-awareness and consciousness. As individuals become more conscious of their sinfulness, their spiritual condition deteriorates, not because awareness is harmful in itself, but because continued sin in the face of such awareness points to a deeper rebellion. In this framework, sin committed without awareness is a form of spiritual death, while sin committed knowingly and unrepentantly becomes a direct rejection of God and the pursuit of true existence. The most severe form of sin, for Kierkegaard, is the conscious decision to remain in sin even when one knows the truth, a choice he identifies as spiritual self-destruction. Although Kierkegaard views sin as a universal human reality, he avoids moral relativism or the idea that all guilt is interchangeable. While every person shares in the fallen condition, each individual is uniquely responsible for their response to it. Some come to recognize the depth of their spiritual crisis and earnestly seek repentance and faith. Others choose avoidance, whether through unconscious social conformity or deliberate resistance, thereby deepening their separation from both God and their genuine self. In the end, Kierkegaard's view of sin, while stark, ultimately points toward hope. It affirms the need for divine grace and the very real possibility of redemption. Sin creates a chasm that no human effort can bridge, but it also lays the groundwork for the emergence of authentic faith. The person who fully confronts their sinful state may be driven to seek reconciliation with God, a relationship through which spiritual integrity and true identity can be restored. Thus, for Kierkegaard, sin is not only humanity's most profound existential crisis, it is also the condition that makes true spiritual transformation, through grace and faith, not only necessary, but possible. Part 3. Repetition versus recollection, forward movement versus looking back. In Repetition, Kierkegaard presents one of his most profound yet commonly misinterpreted concepts, an idea that radically reshapes how we understand time, memory, and the conditions of authentic existence. Through the fictional persona of Constantine Constantius, Kierkegaard probes the question of whether genuine repetition is possible and explores the implications of such a concept for personal development and spiritual deepening. This notion is pivotal for understanding how a person might maintain a consistent sense of self and purpose while undergoing change. It offers a framework for avoiding two existential dead ends: the endless pursuit of aesthetic excitement and the suffocating monotony of unreflective moral routine. By juxtaposing repetition with recollection, Kierkegaard reveals crucial insights about temporality, identity, and what it means to become a true self. To fully appreciate repetition's significance, it's essential to distinguish it from both recurrence and nostalgic remembrance. Recollection involves turning back toward the past, often colored by yearning or sorrow, in an attempt to reclaim what has been lost or extract meaning from it. Kierkegaard proposes that repetition and recollection share a similar structural movement, but travel in opposite temporal directions. Recollection looks backward, while repetition advances forward. In this sense, what is recollected is simply repeated in reverse. Recollection is inherently static, rooted in fixation on what is gone. Repetition, by contrast, is dynamic and grounded in ethical potential. The aesthetic individual is perpetually caught in the pursuit of the novel, quickly losing interest once the allure fades. Ironically, this relentless hunt for newness becomes itself a pattern, an unending loop of boredom and novelty. Such a lifestyle fails to provide lasting meaning as it avoids real engagement and commitment. Life becomes a series of transient passions that never deepen, eroding the possibility of authentic growth and purpose. Recollection, too, embodies a distorted relationship with time. Those who dwell in recollection are held captive by their past, constantly comparing the present to an idealized version of what once was. As one writer insightfully remarked, "Recollection's love is the only happy love," a sentiment Kierkegaard acknowledges, albeit with the important caveat that such happiness is rooted in an initial sorrow. While recollection might offer temporary comfort, it ultimately limits one's capacity to live fully in the present or to imagine new possibilities for the future. Repetition, as envisioned by Constantine Constantius, is a very different endeavor, what he refers to as a process of taking again. The Danish term gentagelse literally means to take again, emphasizing its intentional, active nature. Thus, repetition is not about fleeing the past or blindly chasing novelty. It is a conscious return to what matters, values, commitments, relationships, with the aim of deepening their meaning through renewed engagement. It represents a forward trajectory that builds upon, rather than escapes from, the continuity of experience. According to Kierkegaard, only repetition makes true joy in love possible. It unites the dependability of long-term commitment with the energy of continual renewal. Unlike the love of recollection, which is shadowed by longing or idealization, repetition's love is rooted in the present and free from both anxious hope and sorrowful memory. It avoids the disorientation of endless searching and the melancholy of what's irretrievably lost. Repetition, in this sense, yields what Kierkegaard calls the blissful security of the moment, a state where loyalty to the past and openness to the future converge in a fully inhabited present. This mode of being transcends the binary opposition between nostalgic attachment and nervous anticipation. This concept of repetition also deeply informs Kierkegaard's reflections on love, marriage, and enduring human bonds. In the aesthetic mode, relationships are sustained by novelty and excitement, but these quickly deteriorate into boredom and disenchantment. In the ethical sphere, relationships may persist out of obligation or convention, yet they often lose vitality and become hollow routines. True repetition in relationships involves a deliberate, sustained choice to keep loving the same person, with the relationship gaining richness and depth over time. It is not a passive continuation, but a living renewal, an intentional recommitment that matures through repeated affirmation. To explore whether repetition is truly possible, Constantine Constantius conducts an experiment by returning to Berlin, a city where he had previously experienced great joy. He attempts to recreate those pleasures by revisiting familiar places and activities, hoping to replicate the happiness he once felt. But his efforts fall flat, revealing a critical misunderstanding. He equates repetition with mechanical recurrence rather than transformative renewal. Both he and the circumstances have changed, and thus the past cannot simply be recreated. Constantine finds himself returning to a world that no longer resembles the one he left behind. His former landlord has married. The theater he once frequented has evolved beyond recognition, and he himself has been inwardly transformed. This attempt to revive the past proves futile, revealing a fundamental insight. The past cannot be recreated through external mimicry alone. True repetition is not about reconstructing prior conditions, but about undergoing an internal shift that allows old experiences to be encountered in a new, more profound light. Thus, repetition should not be understood as a literal return to a former place or time, but as the attainment of a spiritual posture from which the lasting significance of past experiences becomes accessible once again. Achieving this demands what Kierkegaard describes as the will to repeat, not the passive indulgence of memory, nor the restless pursuit of novelty, but a deliberate striving toward a deeper reality. In Kierkegaard's philosophy, repetition and religious faith are inseparably intertwined. For Kierkegaard, the highest form of repetition emerges when something freely relinquished is given back by God, not as a mere substitute, but as something wholly renewed. The story of Job embodies this principle. After enduring profound loss, Job maintains his unwavering relationship with the divine. What he ultimately receives is not a simple restoration of what was lost, but a return marked by spiritual transformation and deepened faith. This type of repetition, rooted in spiritual renewal, reveals that what truly matters can be reclaimed, not in its original shape, but in a form enriched by suffering and reflection. Kierkegaard contrasts this with the plight of the young man in repetition who is unable to achieve such renewal in love. Trapped between an idealized memory of his beloved and the moral pressure to marry, he lacks the religious faith necessary for meaningful repetition. The young man's predicament, caught between the aesthetic desire for beauty and the ethical demand of responsibility, prevents him from ascending to the religious sphere where genuine repetition becomes possible. His failure illustrates that repetition requires rising above both superficial pleasure and rigid duty. Only through a relationship with the eternal can present experiences gain the weight and resonance that give repetition its true meaning. Kierkegaard also uses the concept of repetition to delve into the formation of the self. He rejects both the idea of the self as a fixed, immutable essence and the view of identity as endlessly shifting. Instead, he envisions the self as a dynamic process, continually shaped by the repeated confrontation with one's values, relationships, and choices. A fully realized individual neither clings rigidly to the past nor changes aimlessly. Rather, they grow through a discerning process of reaffirming what is essential and allowing what must change to evolve. Repetition, in this sense, offers a third way, a balance between unyielding tradition and chaotic flux. This balanced view of repetition enables true self-development, a kind of growth that is both grounded and responsive. A person who embodies authentic repetition can engage with the new without betraying their deepest convictions. Such a life becomes one of integrated movement, secure yet exploratory, faithful yet progressive, rooted yet adaptive. Kierkegaard's reflections on repetition go beyond the individual and extend to broader cultural and societal dynamics. Just as people thrive through meaningful repetition, so too do communities. Societies flourish when they can preserve the core of their heritage while constructively adapting to changing circumstances. Those that either idolize the past or chase change for its own sake risk losing the capacity to renew themselves. In this light, Kierkegaard provides a profound vision for sustaining both personal integrity and collective identity. His understanding of repetition becomes a roadmap for navigating the passage of time, offering insight into how individuals and institutions alike can maintain continuity while embracing transformation. Part 4. The teleological suspension of the ethical when God transcends morality. One of the most challenging and thought-provoking concepts Søren Kierkegaard presents in Fear and Trembling is the idea of the teleological suspension of the ethical. This concept is deeply intertwined with his interpretation of the biblical account of Abraham, particularly Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac in obedience to a divine command. Kierkegaard uses this narrative to explore the profound conflict between religious faith and moral obligation. He proposes that authentic faith may sometimes require actions that violate universally accepted ethical principles, especially when those principles contradict a divine mandate. In such cases, religious commitment can override moral responsibility, underscoring the ultimate authority of the divine over human ethical systems. However, prioritizing faith in this way comes with an immense cost. Such faith imposes a significant personal burden and demands the courage to act without reliance on standard ethical justification. To grasp what Kierkegaard means by suspending the ethical, we first need to understand his definition of the ethical itself. He sees it as the domain of universally binding moral duties, principles that apply to all individuals and serve as the foundation of social order and human relationships. Within this ethical framework, sin is defined as the act of elevating individual desires above universal moral obligations, turning away from one's duty to uphold the collective moral fabric. From this standpoint, the highest purpose of human life is to submit to the universal by fulfilling ethical duties and contributing to the moral structure that supports society. In this moral universe, the ultimate goal, or telos, of human existence lies in the realization of universal ethical values. Nothing is deemed more important than moral accountability, and individuals are expected to rise above personal preferences to serve the moral law. Philosophers like Hegel emphasize the importance of integrating individuals into the ethical totality of their community and caution against the dangers of isolated subjectivity. From such a perspective, any deviation from universal moral laws is inherently wrong. Actions that contradict these norms must be judged harshly, regardless of personal or spiritual motivations. But Abraham's story disrupts this moral paradigm. When he receives God's command to sacrifice Isaac, he is confronted with a choice that defies all ethical explanation. By every human measure, the idea of killing one's own child is a grave moral atrocity, a direct betrayal of parental love, and a clear violation of ethical duty. Yet Abraham is convinced that God's directive obligates him to act, even though the act itself cannot be justified through any known ethical lens. Kierkegaard insists that this is not a tragic conflict in the conventional sense. He contrasts Abraham's dilemma with that of Agamemnon from Greek tragedy, who sacrifices his daughter Iphigenia to secure a favorable outcome for the Greek army. Agamemnon, though faced with a harrowing choice, remains within the boundaries of ethical reasoning. His sacrifice is made in service of political and communal interests, and therefore can be morally interpreted. Though tragic, Agamemnon's act is still understandable in ethical terms, because it involves a conflict between competing moral obligations. He chooses the course that benefits the greater good, and thus operates within the moral sphere. Abraham, by contrast, faces a completely different kind of decision. His readiness to sacrifice Isaac cannot be rationalized by any ethical principle or societal benefit. Abraham acts outside the confines of the ethical altogether. His decision is not supported by any overarching moral law or communal justification. In fact, by preparing to kill Isaac, he endangers the very promise through which God had assured him that he would be the progenitor of a great nation. This is why Kierkegaard identifies Abraham's act as a teleological suspension of the ethical. In this context, teleological refers to the end or purpose guiding an action, while suspension implies a temporary setting aside of ethical obligations, not due to their irrelevance, but because of a higher divine calling. Abraham sets aside his moral duty to Isaac not because he dismisses ethics, but because he recognizes a divine command that demands a deeper allegiance. His duty to God overrides even the most sacred human responsibilities. This suspension does not imply a wholesale rejection of ethical values. Rather, it acknowledges that God's will occupies a plane beyond the reach of human morality. The ethical is not discarded, but is eclipsed in light of a higher divine purpose. Crucially, this elevation of the religious above the ethical does not reduce the seriousness of Abraham's decision. He remains fully aware that, from a moral standpoint, the act of sacrificing Isaac is utterly indefensible. Nevertheless, he proceeds, carrying the full weight of this choice on his shoulders. The teleological suspension of the ethical is not a loophole or a moral excuse. It is a profound act of faith that embodies the most intense form of existential responsibility. Abraham's actions exist outside the boundaries of ordinary human comprehension and expression. They resist explanation through logic or moral reasoning. His choice isolates him completely, leaving him unable to disclose the true nature of his intentions even to those dearest to him, neither to his wife Sarah nor to his son Isaac. This profound solitude is not an incidental consequence, but a defining aspect of what Kierkegaard describes as the teleological suspension of the ethical. Had Abraham been able to justify his actions using universally accepted ethical principles, his deed would still fall within the realm of moral reasoning, simply reflecting allegiance to a higher ethical order. But the truly radical dimension of his act lies in its seeming violation of all moral logic. What sets his action apart is precisely this lack of rational justification, revealing a genuine suspension of ethical norms in submission to divine will. Abraham does not rely on reason. He responds in absolute faith, surrendering the assurance that comes from moral validation and societal approval. Kierkegaard makes it clear that such religious acts must not be confused with impulsive rebellion or unthinking zealotry. The teleological suspension of the ethical is not an escape clause for those wishing to sidestep moral accountability under the pretense of divine instruction. What distinguishes Abraham's situation is the uniqueness of his personal relationship with God and the specific nature of the divine command and promise entrusted to him. Those who invoke divine authority to excuse morally questionable actions are, more often than not, either gravely misguided or intentionally deceitful. This concept also draws attention to the inherent limitations of reason when it comes to understanding religious faith. If spiritual truths could be logically demonstrated, or if religious duties could be neatly reduced to moral formulas, then faith would be redundant. What makes faith both essential and profoundly demanding is its occasional requirement to move beyond the bounds of rational ethics. This does not mean faith is irrational. Rather, it indicates that faith transcends the limits of human logic. The idea of suspending the ethical for a higher purpose has significant implications for how we interpret religious authority and the tension between personal conviction and collective morality. While much religious and ethical teaching emphasizes alignment with shared values and communal standards, Kierkegaard suggests that authentic faith may, in exceptional circumstances, lead one to act against conventional moral expectations. This places an enormous responsibility on the individual, who must discern a genuine divine command from personal ambition or cultural pressure. The fact that faith can sometimes override ethical norms makes the religious path both more serious and more precarious than a purely moral one. Yet Kierkegaard strongly emphasizes that such ethical suspensions are rare and extraordinary. In nearly all situations, religious life calls for the full embrace of ethical duties rather than their rejection. For most people of faith, belief strengthens their moral commitments and deepens their engagement with justice and social responsibility. Thus, the suspension of ethical obligations arises only in exceptional moments, when a divine mandate stands in direct opposition to established moral codes. Responding to such a situation requires an extraordinary level of spiritual clarity and a deeply genuine relationship with God, a spiritual height that few ever reach. Part 5. Christianity versus Christendom, Kierkegaard's critique of institutional religion. Søren Kierkegaard reserved some of his most intense and sustained criticism for what he saw as a profound disconnect between authentic Christian faith and what he called Christendom, the institutional, state-sanctioned version of Christianity that had become dominant in Danish society. Over the course of his life, this distinction grew increasingly central to his thought and writings. In the final years of his life, Kierkegaard launched a fierce attack on the Danish Lutheran Church. At the core of his condemnation was the belief that organized religion had fundamentally compromised the radical nature of Christianity. By domesticating the faith, making it socially acceptable, comfortable, and routine, the Church had, in his view, betrayed its true essence. His analysis remains remarkably insightful for understanding the tension between heartfelt religious conviction and the often rigid structures of institutional belief. To Kierkegaard, Christendom symbolized the co-opting of Christianity by societal norms. What was once a demanding and transformative spiritual journey had been reduced to a cultural habit. Under this system, identifying as a Christian required no real internal change, just compliance with customary practices, church attendance, and public alignment with accepted religious forms. This kind of external conformity, Kierkegaard warned, created a dangerous self-deception. People assumed they were living faithfully simply because they participated in religious traditions and lived in a Christianized culture. But this, he argued, only masked the lack of a genuine relationship with God, which he saw as the heart of real faith. He believed that institutional religion had shifted authority away from the divine and placed it in the hands of the collective, what he often referred to as the crowd. In sharp contrast, Kierkegaard asserted that truth is always personal, experience, never something discovered collectively, just as love is directed toward an individual rather than an abstract group. Truth is also encountered one person at a time. As he pointed out, the Bible contains no command to love the crowd, nor does it suggest that the majority opinion is the measure of spiritual truth. For Kierkegaard, this glorification of the collective diluted the deeply individual and existential nature of Christianity. The shift from Christianity to Christendom, he argued, introduced several major distortions, each of which he scrutinized with sharp precision. First, the emphasis moved away from lived faith and inward transformation, becoming focused instead on external knowledge. People came to equate understanding theological concepts and memorizing Scripture with genuine belief. This intellectualized religion, Kierkegaard argued, fostered what he called an illusion of faith, where people mistook knowledge about Christianity for true personal commitment to its teachings. Second, Christianity lost its character as a personal, risky commitment and became a matter of cultural expectation. In Christendom, being a Christian simply meant adhering to social roles and behaviors approved by religious society, rather than making a difficult, solitary decision to follow Christ. This removed the personal wrestling, vulnerability, and moral responsibility that Kierkegaard saw as essential to true faith. Once Christianity became socially safe and respectable, it no longer required the leap of faith it once demanded. Third, the uncompromising moral teachings of Christianity were watered down to suit everyday life. Commands to love one's enemies, practice self-denial, and detach from worldly possessions were either ignored or reinterpreted in ways that avoided conflict and discomfort. Kierkegaard described this as playing Christianity, going through the motions of religion while avoiding its deeper, more unsettling challenges. This diluted version of faith no longer disrupted complacency or challenged cultural norms. Instead, it served to reinforce the status quo and maintain comfort. Kierkegaard was particularly critical of the clergy, whom he saw as the chief architects of this distortion. Rather than acting as guides to spiritual truth, he viewed the ministers of his day as bureaucrats, maintainers of order and social harmony, not prophets of divine transformation. In his eyes, they had become too invested in the institutions they should have been questioning. Their positions granted them security, prestige, and authority, but at the expense of spiritual integrity. Instead of calling people to deep and difficult faith, they offered comfort that demanded nothing and changed nothing. Ultimately, Kierkegaard believed that the institutional church had ceased to be a path to genuine Christianity. Far from guiding individuals toward God, it had become a hindrance, an obstacle standing in the way of true spiritual encounter. By reducing Christianity to a collection of doctrines to be intellectually accepted rather than a dynamic way of living, the Church has stripped away the essential inner struggle and spiritual evolution that genuine faith demands. People have been able to join, participate in rituals, and outwardly align with Christian beliefs without ever experiencing the kind of transformative encounter with God that defines true discipleship. This institutionalized model of religion has served as an obstacle, hindering believers from developing a personal and immediate connection with the divine, the very essence of what Christianity seeks to nurture. Søren Kierkegaard envisioned authentic Christianity as an intensely personal journey, marked by radical devotion, not something that can be inherited, mediated through social structures, or passed on through tradition. To Kierkegaard, faith goes far beyond admiring Jesus or understanding theological concepts. It calls for imitation, an intentional and courageous effort to live as Christ did, embracing the suffering, danger, and resistance that inevitably accompany such a path. Rather than striving for the societal respectability often associated with a Christian identity, true followers must be willing to walk a more difficult road, one that may include rejection and sacrifice, placing their relationship with God above all, worldly recognition or achievement. One of Kierkegaard's central concerns was the difference between becoming a Christian and merely assuming the title through cultural inheritance. In a society where Christianity is the dominant norm, many come to believe they are Christians simply by being born into it. But Kierkegaard challenged this assumption, arguing that faith is not something passed down. It must be deliberately chosen and deeply internalized. Regardless of family background or societal pressure, each individual must make a conscious, often difficult decision to pursue the demanding path of authentic Christian living. His final year was marked by a fierce confrontation with the Danish state church, which epitomized his sharpest critique of institutionalized faith. He refused communion and publicly condemned the clergy, whom he saw not as true servants of Christ, but as agents of the state promoting passive conformity. In his provocative journal, The Moment, he launched an unrelenting critique of what he considered the Church's abandonment of real Christianity. This mission, pursued with unyielding intensity, ultimately cost him his health and hastened his death. Yet it was his last urgent attempt to awaken people to the vast gulf between genuine discipleship and the spiritual complacency of Christendom. Kierkegaard's insights continue to echo powerfully in today's religious context. The inclination to dilute the demanding nature of faith, to elevate intellectual agreement over personal transformation, and to treat religion as a cultural or social identity instead of a living commitment remains a persistent threat. Religious institutions often struggle to balance their roles as sources of comfort and belonging with the much harder task of calling people into deep, sometimes painful, spiritual change. Still, Kierkegaard's critique should not be misread as a total dismissal of organized religion or faith communities. His target was not the existence of such structures, but their tendency to substitute genuine faith with superficial conformity. When properly aligned with their purpose, religious communities can play a vital role in supporting those on the journey toward spiritual depth. The essential challenge is ensuring that these institutions serve as catalysts for personal transformation, not as replacements for the life-changing, deeply personal relationship with God that stands at the core of the Christian faith. Part 6. The Individual versus the Crowd. the cornerstone of authentic existence. Kierkegaard made a striking and provocative claim when he declared that the crowd is untruth. This assertion remains one of the boldest challenges in the history of philosophy, confronting deeply embedded societal norms and habits. To understand why Kierkegaard considered the crowd fundamentally at odds with truth and authentic being, we must examine how these ideas function within his larger philosophical vision. For Kierkegaard, the crowd meant far more than a mere assembly of people. He understood it as a social construct, an environment in which individuals willingly obscure their personal accountability and distinctiveness. The crowd becomes a refuge for those who would rather dissolve into collective anonymity than face the demands of individual responsibility. It is a psychological escape route where conscience and independent thought are exchanged for the security of majority consensus. This collective mentality fosters what Kierkegaard termed leveling, a quiet yet pervasive force that erodes personal uniqueness. Unlike overt systems of control, leveling operates through subtle social pressure, blurring the lines that define personal character, intention, and destiny. It treats all opinions, talents, and aspirations as equal, not in a liberating sense, but in a way that dilutes meaning and suppresses individuality. The result is a homogenized existence in which people lose their personal depth, becoming indistinguishable parts of a social mass. Kierkegaard saw this flattening of individuality as an emerging feature of the modern world. He was especially alarmed by the rise of mass media, which he believed intensified the effects of leveling. While previous eras were driven by passion and idealism, he argued that modernity was marked by apathy, intellectual posturing, and widespread envy. At the center of this condition was the rise of what he called the public, a vague, impersonal entity largely constructed by the press. This public, as Kierkegaard described it, lacks any real substance. It has no face, no voice, and no ethical anchor, yet it asserts authority over truth, value, and purpose. Kierkegaard recognized with uncanny prescience how the media could fabricate this fiction of collective opinion. The duller the time, the stronger the press, he noted, observing how media influence thrives in eras of spiritual lethargy. In his view, the press elevated superficial consensus to the level of universal truth, offering prepackaged beliefs that people adopted without critical reflection. Through this process, individuals become spectators of their own lives rather than active agents within them. Yet, what drives people to trade personal authenticity for the comfort of the crowd? For Kierkegaard, the answer lies in the immense difficulty of true individuality. To live as a genuine self, to take full responsibility for one's beliefs, actions, and inner life, is an overwhelming task. Many choose instead to disappear into the anonymity of the group. He observed that most people are afraid to stand alone. The crowd offers a seductive illusion of safety. It promises belonging, predictability, and shared responsibility. It is far easier to live within a defined societal role than to confront the demands of authentic existence. As a result, many settle into lives of quiet conformity, avoiding the existential challenges that come with real selfhood. But this comfort comes at a significant cost. Just as desert travelers form caravans not out of companionship, but from fear of external threats, modern individuals band together, not against wild animals or hostile terrain, but against the uncertainties of life itself. They find the courage to exist only by merging with the collective, mistaking membership in the group for genuine being. Yet in doing so, they silence their inner convictions, relinquish direct engagement with truth, and surrender the moral agency required to make meaningful choices. What remains is a life shaped by replication rather than originality. Kierkegaard described such individuals not as true participants in life, but as its pale imitations. Central to the crowd's power is a corrosive force he identified as resentment, a deep-seated bitterness that leads people to externalize their own inadequacies. When someone dares to live authentically and rise above mediocrity, they are often met with hostility from the majority. The crowd, threatened by what it cannot achieve, turns these individuals into objects of ridicule and scorn. This dynamic enables the crowd to protect its illusion of virtue by tearing down those who threaten its complacency. Envy becomes the crowd's weapon of choice, ensuring that those who pursue integrity and independence are punished for their efforts. In this way, the crowd upholds its mediocrity and suppresses excellence, all while claiming to represent truth. The masses often struggle to confront the reality of what they've surrendered in exchange for the comfort of perceived security. In this climate of uniformity and shared concession, Søren Kierkegaard proposed the ideal of the single individual, a concept that stood in stark contrast to the prevailing spirit of the collective. For Kierkegaard, this ideal personified the intensely private and subjective core of human life. To become a true individual meant to step beyond the sway of the majority and to assume full ownership of one's existence. Such a person recognizes that truth is not dictated by popularity or collective agreement. Rather, it must be uncovered through inner reflection and a personal, unwavering commitment. Kierkegaard maintained that truth is most often found with the few, precisely because the few are typically those who possess deep and genuine convictions. By contrast, the strength of the majority is frequently an illusion, composed of people whose beliefs lack substance or personal investment. This outlook helps explain why those who are truly authentic often find themselves estranged from dominant norms and mainstream ideologies. Their dissent is not fueled by a desire to provoke or oppose, but by the laborious journey they have taken to develop beliefs anchored in first-hand experience, not in inherited dogma. For Kierkegaard, the road to becoming such a person required the greatest of all human faculties, the ability to be alone. A person's worth, he argued, is reflected in their capacity to endure solitude, especially the kind that offers no recognition, no affirmation, and no shared understanding. To remain alone, particularly when faced with moments of profound existential weight, is to be free from the childish dependence on others' approval and the compulsive desire to conform. Yet Kierkegaard's vision of solitude is not to be confused with isolation or emotional withdrawal. It is a state of inward freedom, a kind of spiritual self-sufficiency that enables genuine choice without the crutch of societal validation. He anticipated that his emphasis on the individual might be misinterpreted as narcissism or anti-social retreat. In truth, his message was the exact opposite. He believed that only those who had cultivated true individuality were capable of offering real love to others and contributing meaningfully to the world. As Kierkegaard once observed, nowhere in Scripture is there a command to love the crowd, nor should we look to the crowd as the final arbiter of moral or spiritual truth. Love, he argued, cannot be extended to humanity as an abstract concept. It must be lived out through intimate, personal relationships with specific individuals. At the center of Kierkegaard's thought was the idea that a person's connection to eternal truth could only be forged in solitude. The eternal, the absolute, can be grasped only when one stands alone before it. And this act of standing alone, which every human being has the power to choose, is what opens the way to divine guidance. In Kierkegaard's view, the crowd is not merely neutral, it embodies falsehood. Thus, individuality was not a philosophical preference for him. It was a spiritual necessity. He held that the eternal relationship each person has with God cannot be outsourced to traditions, institutions, or communal beliefs. Embracing individuality over conformity involves real cost. For Kierkegaard, martyrdom was not just about physical suffering. It was about the confrontation with the crowd and the sacrifices demanded by authenticity. To live truthfully is to accept the risk of being alienated, misunderstood, and even rejected by those who find reassurance in sameness. This calling requires strength, a deep inner conviction to remain faithful to one's beliefs in the face of opposition. But for Kierkegaard, this difficult path was not only possible, it was essential for a life of true meaning. Those who chart their course according to their own discovered values, rather than the shifting tides of public opinion, are far more likely to find purpose and joy. More than that, they are uniquely equipped to enrich society, offering original ideas and perspectives grounded in authenticity rather than imitation. Such individuals become sources of renewal and bearers of truth in a world increasingly defined by conformity and cultural flattening. While the crowd continues to represent deception and superficiality, the person who chooses the hard road of authenticity steps into the realm of what is most real, most lasting, and most deeply human. Part 7. The Three Modes of Being, a Pathway Through Human Growth. Søren Kierkegaard's exploration of human life unfolds most powerfully in his depiction of three fundamental modes of existence: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. These stages represent profoundly different ways of relating to life, each offering its own worldview and set of priorities. Unlike developmental models in psychology that describe predictable or biological sequences, Kierkegaard's stages are existential in nature. They are not linear or guaranteed. Transitioning between them requires conscious choice and an inward transformation. To grasp these stages is to see more clearly the architecture of human life, and to open oneself to a more authentic way of being. The initial stage, known as the aesthetic, is perhaps the most easily embraced and widely lived. It is defined by a focus on pleasure, beauty, and immediate gratification, with minimal concern for lasting consequences or the impact one's actions may have on others. In this mode, the individual is consumed with the present moment, constantly seeking stimulation and novelty to avoid routine or boredom. Central to this perspective is what Kierkegaard called the interesting, the ongoing hunt for experiences that amuse, delight, or distract without asking anything deeper in return. This aesthetic approach to life holds a strong appeal, especially for those at the threshold of adulthood or new experiences. It presents existence as an open field of possibilities where experimentation is encouraged and obligations are deferred. Within this stage, life is treated almost like a canvas, carefully designed to maximize enjoyment and avoid discomfort. The aesthetic individual curates experiences with the precision of an artist, ensuring that nothing disrupts their freedom or closes off future potential. The highest value is maintaining the ability to choose and to keep choosing. Yet Kierkegaard argued that this mode of living inevitably leads to collapse, since choices are made based on momentary desires rather than any coherent vision or guiding principles. The aesthetic life gradually loses its vitality. What once felt exhilarating becomes repetitive, and the quest for newness begins to wear thin. At some point, the individual may confront a deep sense of emptiness, a spiritual fatigue Kierkegaard identified as despair. This despair may not always be consciously recognized. It often disguises itself as boredom, dissatisfaction, or vague unease. One of the deeper problems with aesthetic existence is its inherently self-focused nature. Since pleasure is the primary aim, relationships and commitments are often approached in terms of what they can offer rather than what they require. Genuine selflessness becomes difficult, if not impossible, to sustain. The aesthetic life resists any sacrifice that might limit personal freedom, and as a result, deeper human connections tend to wither. Without enduring bonds or shared burdens, the individual grows isolated, adrift in a sea of diversions that no longer satisfy. Eventually, the pressure of this inner crisis can become too great to ignore, prompting a decisive break and the emergence of a new mode of existence, the ethical. This stage marks a radical shift in orientation, from living for oneself to living responsibly in the context of a shared world. The ethical person accepts the weight of moral duty and strives to act in accordance with universal values. They begin to see life as a task, one that requires discipline, integrity, and a commitment to both personal development and the welfare of others. In contrast to the impulsiveness of the aesthetic stage, the ethical mode emphasizes deliberate choice grounded in principle. Life gains coherence through long-term commitments, whether to a career, a marriage, or a community. Kierkegaard illustrates this stage most vividly through one of his pseudonymous figures, Judge William, who champions the ethical life as the path to true selfhood. For Judge William, marriage serves as a profound example of ethical commitment, a union that brings the spiritual into the realm of the everyday through devotion, patience, and continuity over time. Those living ethically do not measure life by fleeting enjoyment, but by their ability to do what is right. Fulfillment comes not from novelty, but from purpose. They accept the limitations and responsibilities that come with adulthood, recognizing that genuine meaning often requires sacrifice. While the aesthetic individual chases happiness, the ethical person seeks wholeness, finding satisfaction in being consistent with their values and accountable to others. The rewards of ethical existence are deep and lasting. Individuals who embrace this path discover that acting with integrity brings a richer joy than any immediate pleasure can provide. They come to value loyalty, perseverance, and love that endures, not because these things are easy, but because they are real. In serving others and fulfilling obligations, they cultivate a sense of identity rooted not in desire, but in commitment. In this way, the ethical stage opens the door to a more mature, meaningful, and grounded form of life. Kierkegaard argued that while the ethical stage represents a progression beyond the aesthetic, it remains deeply flawed in its own right. Although universal moral principles aim to guide behavior with integrity, they often fall short when confronted with the complexities of real human experience. In some instances, unwavering commitment to ethical rules can trigger inner turmoil or guilt, particularly when those rules clash with a person's most profound values. Individuals operating within this stage may come to feel that society's moral expectations constrain their ability to face unique moral dilemmas, or to form a deeply personal bond with the divine. One of the core shortcomings of the ethical stage is its presumption that moral conduct is equivalent to spiritual completion. It fosters the idea that living in accordance with universally endorsed ethical norms automatically results in the highest form of human life. Yet Kierkegaard noted that even those who exemplify moral virtue may experience a spiritual emptiness if their actions arise more from external obligation than from genuine inner commitment. In this sense, the ethical life risks becoming yet another form of conformity, not to the pursuit of pleasure, as in the aesthetic life, but to the societal ideal of moral propriety. This internal crisis, this sense of disillusionment, often serves as the turning point that drives a person toward a deeper level of existence, the religious. The religious stage marks a profound reorientation of the self, in which the individual enters into a deeply personal and transformative relationship with God, one that transcends both aesthetic pleasure and moral duty. At the heart of this stage is what Kierkegaard described as the leap of faith, a passionate, non-rational act of commitment that goes beyond both reason and ethical principles. Those who reach this stage come to realize that their ultimate allegiance lies not with societal standards or abstract moral laws, but with God, who demands total devotion and becomes the supreme authority in their life. In embracing this religious mode of existence, the individual arrives at what Kierkegaard believed to be the ultimate purpose of human life. This is not characterized by external religiosity or public displays of faith, but by an inward, life-altering encounter with the divine. The religious person recognizes that neither intellectual insight nor ethical conduct alone can bring about true fulfillment. Instead, they accept their dependence on divine grace and surrender to a transcendent power that offers lasting meaning and direction. Importantly, Kierkegaard did not present these stages as a straightforward or automatic progression. Many people remain within the aesthetic sphere for the entirety of their lives, continually seeking diversion and avoiding deeper responsibility. Others may attain the ethical stage, gaining societal respect and personal integrity, but never move beyond it into the realm of genuine faith. Progressing from one stage to the next is not a passive process. It requires deliberate self-reflection and is often triggered by existential crises or moments of deep personal reckoning. Moreover, the more advanced stages do not negate the earlier ones, but rather reinterpret and elevate them. Someone who reaches the religious stage does not renounce beauty or disregard ethical obligation. Instead, they view these dimensions of life through the lens of their commitment to God. Each stage contains valuable insights that contribute to the richness of human development, but it is only through the religious lens that these elements achieve their fullest meaning. In the end, what Kierkegaard emphasizes is the proper ordering of life's priorities and the unification of all dimensions of existence under a divine framework. It is this religious foundation, he believed, that imbues aesthetic delight and moral action with enduring purpose and spiritual weight. Part 8. Anxiety and the Notion of Dread, the Vertigo of Freedom. Søren Kierkegaard saw anxiety as a fundamental aspect of the human experience, a concept that would later become pivotal in existential philosophy and psychological thought. Unlike fear, which arises in response to a clear and present danger, anxiety emerges from our awareness of freedom and the infinite choices it brings. This form of anxiety captures the paradox at the heart of human existence. It is both the expression of our highest potential and the source of our deepest unease. While we are granted the freedom to shape our lives, that same freedom forces us to bear the weight of our decisions and the unpredictability of their consequences. Understanding Kierkegaard's perspective on anxiety is essential for grasping what it means to live authentically. A crucial first step in this understanding is separating anxiety from mere fear. Fear pertains to external threats, those things outside of us that might harm our safety or disrupt our happiness, often beyond our direct control. Anxiety, however, is an inward disturbance, born from the realization that we hold the power to choose. It is a discomfort that arises not from external circumstances, but from within, from the realization that we are free to make choices that could define or destroy us. The anxious individual is unsettled not by the world, but by the infinite potential of their own freedom. For Kierkegaard, anxiety is not just a psychological state, it is the very expression of human freedom. He famously described it as the possibility of possibility. To clarify this idea, he presented a powerful metaphor: a person standing on a precipice. That individual experiences two distinct reactions. First, the instinctive fear of accidentally falling, and second, the far more disturbing realization that they could choose to jump. It is this second reaction, the conscious awareness that one could deliberately step into the void, that Kierkegaard labeled the dizziness of freedom. Just as physical vertigo unsettles our sense of balance, existential anxiety disrupts our sense of certainty when we confront the open-endedness of our freedom. This experience makes us aware that we not only have the ability to make wise and noble choices, but also to destroy ourselves through those same choices. The enormity of this freedom induces a kind of spiritual vertigo, a mix of awe and terror in the face of limitless potential. Kierkegaard traced the origins of this existential anxiety back to the biblical story of Adam in Eden. Before disobeying God, Adam existed in a state of innocence, an existence untouched by the concepts of right and wrong. But the moment God forbade him from eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge, Adam became aware of his capacity to choose, and with it, the possibility of disobedience. For Kierkegaard, this moment, not the actual act of sin, marks the true birth of anxiety. What's crucial in this account is that Adam's anxiety began not after he sinned, but before, in the moment he became conscious of his own freedom. This primal anxiety was not a result of guilt, but of possibility. It represents a turning point in human consciousness, a recognition that we are free beings, capable of defying even divine commands. This early experience of anxiety was not sinful in itself, but a natural response of the self when it encounters the vast landscape of freedom and the uncertainty it entails. Once we become aware of ourselves as agents of choice, we also become aware of the risk that we could choose wrongly. This awareness is the source of anxiety. It emerges when we realize that our lives are shaped by the decisions we make, and that we alone are responsible for them. For Kierkegaard, this realization signals the birth of self-consciousness. As children, we grow and develop mostly through unconscious processes, fulfilling our natural potential without needing to reflect deeply on our actions. But with maturity comes a different phase of development, a point at which we awaken to the fact of our own freedom. Symbolically, this is Adam's act of eating the forbidden fruit. In doing so, he doesn't just learn about good and evil. He becomes aware of freedom itself. And with that realization comes the understanding that life is made up of limitless options, each choice leading to a distinct path and an unknown future. This confrontation with infinite freedom is what gives rise to the uniquely human form of anxiety Kierkegaard describes. Unlike animals, which are guided by instinct, or machines, which follow pre-programmed logic, human beings must determine their own values and identities. It is precisely this freedom to define ourselves, to make meaningful choices, that enables true existence. Yet it also exposes us to the possibility of failure, paralysis, or despair. In standing before the future, we resemble a person gazing into a deep chasm, both empowered by the potential of choice and unsettled by the boundlessness it represents. Kierkegaard, however, warned against viewing anxiety as merely a curse of the human condition. He believed that anxiety plays a vital role in our personal and spiritual development. It is not simply a symptom of freedom's weight, but an essential step toward becoming a fully realized self. Confronting anxiety is an unavoidable part of the human experience, one that must be faced if we hope to avoid spiritual stagnation. The danger lies both in evading anxiety altogether and in being overtaken by it. To truly grasp the nature of anxiety is to uncover something profoundly important. It forces us to acknowledge the reality of our own freedom and the heavy burden of responsibility that comes with it, preventing us from drifting through life in a state of passive conformity or mindless comfort. Anxiety is the gateway to freedom. When experienced through the lens of faith, it becomes a powerful teacher. It tears down the illusions attached to temporary ambitions, revealing their fundamental emptiness. In doing so, it awakens us, not only to our potential for greatness and meaningful achievement, but also to our susceptibility to moral failure and self-destruction. While this awareness can be overwhelming, it is precisely what makes authentic choice and personal growth possible. Without the discomfort that anxiety brings, we would remain trapped in cycles of thoughtless repetition, unable to see who we are or envision who we might become. Kierkegaard underscores anxiety's vital role in the process of creativity. He argues that creativity involves more than producing works or ideas. It also entails the act of becoming oneself through conscious choice. This form of self-creation along with the broader creative process that unfolds in everyday life, inevitably stirs anxiety. True creativity demands not just construction, but also the deconstruction of what is known, comfortable, or conventional, both within us and around us. Each act of creation is also an act of disruption. This is why Kierkegaard associated intense creativity with a heightened sense of anxiety and guilt. To bring something new into existence requires the courage to go beyond established norms, accepting the possibility of failure, rejection, or misunderstanding. The anxiety linked to creative endeavor comes from the recognition that every beginning necessitates an ending. Each genuine innovation requires a letting go of the past to make space for something unprecedented. However, anxiety becomes destructive when we try to escape the freedom it exposes. In attempting to mute our anxiety by fleeing from responsibility, we inevitably fall into despair. Refusing to engage with the possibilities available to us drains our lives of vitality and meaning. A life stripped of freedom and possibility becomes stagnant, lifeless, and devoid of hope. Because freedom and possibility are inseparable from anxiety, our goal should not be to eliminate anxiety, but to learn how to live with it wisely. The real test is learning how to coexist with anxiety without being consumed by it. We often face a stark choice: to embrace anxiety or to succumb to despair. Moving forward as our inner truth demands may bring anxiety, but standing still risks falling into a depression that erodes our very sense of purpose. What we need is the strength to endure anxiety while still making meaningful, authentic choices rooted in our deepest values. Achieving this requires what Kierkegaard called faith, the inner resolve to act even in the face of uncertainty. For him, anxiety was not a sign of psychological weakness, but an essential part of what it means to be human. Our existence is caught between paradoxes, the finite and the infinite, necessity and possibility, time and eternity. It is from this tension that anxiety naturally emerges. Rather than treating this uncertainty as a flaw, Kierkegaard saw it as both the price and the privilege of living genuinely. It is precisely because we are capable of anxiety that we are also capable of true freedom, original creativity, and spiritual depth. Part 9. Faith and the Leap. Beyond reason into the absurd. Søren Kierkegaard regarded faith as the highest expression of human life, an intense and challenging endeavor that demands what he famously described as a leap into the absurd. This leap does not stem from rational analysis, logical reasoning, or ethical progression. Instead, it is a passionate, inward commitment that surpasses the limits of reason and intellectual understanding. Kierkegaard's portrayal of faith reveals why he considered it both the noblest human aspiration and the most formidable obstacle. For him, faith arises precisely at the point where rationality reaches its limit. This captures the central paradox in his religious philosophy. True devotion does not begin with certainty, but with the recognition that reason alone is insufficient. While rationality can organize data, weigh possibilities, and draw conclusions, it remains incapable of bridging the gap between finite human understanding and the infinite nature of the divine. Faith, then, requires a relinquishment of intellectual assurance and an acceptance of something that, from a logical perspective appears implausible or even absurd. This notion of the absurd is fundamental to Kierkegaard's concept of belief. Importantly, the absurd is not simply that which is irrational or self-contradictory. Instead, it points to a realm that lies entirely beyond the grasp of human reasoning. The clearest illustration of this, in Kierkegaard's view, is the Christian claim that the eternal God became incarnate in a mortal human being. To the rational mind, this assertion is scandalous, an affront to philosophical logic. Yet this very offense to reason is central to the nature of faith. If the existence of God could be conclusively demonstrated through logic or empirical science, then belief would become just another form of knowledge, and faith, in its distinctiveness, would vanish. It is precisely the inability to logically prove God's existence or to objectively confirm spiritual truths that makes faith both necessary and unique. Faith is born in the absence of certainty, in the space that reason cannot fill. Kierkegaard drew a sharp distinction between two kinds of truth, the objective and the subjective. Objective truth refers to facts that can be tested, verified, and universally agreed upon, independent of the observer. Subjective truth, by contrast, emphasizes the individual's personal relationship to what they believe. In matters of ultimate significance, such as religious faith, subjective truth holds greater weight than objective verification. The real question is not whether God's existence can be proven, but whether a person lives in a way that reflects belief in God. This shift from proving truth to embodying it fundamentally transforms what it means to be religious. Faith is no longer a matter of assenting to demonstrable doctrines, but involves entrusting oneself entirely to profound uncertainties. The believer commits their entire being to something that can never be fully known or conclusively demonstrated. Kierkegaard's insistence on the personal and inward character of faith is summarized in his well-known declaration that truth is subjectivity. This was not a rejection of factual truth or a slide into relativism. Rather, he argued that the most significant truths, those that concern existence, purpose, and identity, cannot be approached from a disinterested or external stance. They require complete personal engagement and a willingness to be transformed by them. To clarify this, Kierkegaard distinguished between two types of reflection. Objective reflection attempts to understand from a detached, supposedly universal standpoint. In this mode, the thinker remains an onlooker, separated from the subject of contemplation. Subjective reflection, however, acknowledges that the seeker is personally involved in the truth they pursue. In questions concerning life's deepest meanings, such as faith and purpose, only subjective reflection can yield authentic insight. These are not topics that lend themselves to detached reasoning. They demand existential investment. The leap of faith occurs when one stops seeking comfort in rational certainties and throws oneself wholeheartedly into belief, regardless of the lack of objective proof. This leap is not irrational in the sense of being reckless or arbitrary. Instead, it is a deeply thoughtful and emotionally intense commitment, made with full awareness of the uncertainty it entails. It is a courageous act, a free decision to embrace the unknowable in spite of all that cannot be assured. The person who embraces the leap of faith does so with full awareness that their belief might be wrong, yet they choose to believe nonetheless. This decision is not made lightly, but rather because what's at stake is of infinite significance and the potential reward beyond measure. Søren Kierkegaard insisted that such a leap cannot be taken cautiously or incrementally. Faith is not something one arrives at by degrees through logic or calculated thought. It requires a sudden and absolute departure from reliance on rational evidence. One must either leap completely or remain mired in the paralysis of objective ambiguity. There is no gradual bridge from skepticism to belief, no middle ground that permits someone to cling to reason while slowly stepping into faith. This kind of wholehearted commitment, Kierkegaard argued, involves what he called the teleological suspension of the ethical. That is, authentic religious faith might require a person to take actions that, on the surface, appear to violate conventional moral standards, especially when those standards seem to conflict with divine will. To the faithful, God's authority transcends all human-made ethical systems and societal norms. This creates an intense internal struggle, as the individual may feel driven to act in ways that defy explanation or justification within traditional moral reasoning. But this suspension of ethics should not be interpreted as a rejection of morality itself. Nor does it give believers license to ignore their moral duties. Rather, it means that when divine command stands at odds with accepted codes of conduct, the believer must be willing to follow the higher spiritual directive. Such a path requires tremendous courage, careful discernment, and the wisdom to tell apart true divine guidance from personal delusion or fanaticism. Anyone making this leap must bear full responsibility for their choice. They cannot point to logic, social consensus, or tradition to justify their faith. For Kierkegaard, belief is not a purely rational enterprise devoid of emotion. It is an impassioned, all-consuming act. This intensity is not optional, but central to his understanding of what it means to believe. It is this passionate drive that propels a person to seek a truth that lies beyond the physical world, even when all reasoning seems to contradict it. It's the willingness to live for, and even sacrifice one's life for, a conviction, to risk everything for a truth that surpasses earthly meaning. In Kierkegaard's philosophy, this is the truest form of faith, a burning commitment rooted in passion. Yet he also recognized that faith is not fixed or final. Genuine faith must be reaffirmed constantly. It isn't a one-time decision that remains valid forever, but a continuous act of will carried out amid unrelenting doubt and uncertainty. The believer doesn't achieve a permanent state of inner peace or certainty, but must daily choose to believe, as though their deepest commitments are real and binding. Kierkegaard described this ongoing struggle as repetition, the capacity to remain firm in faith while also growing spiritually and intellectually over time. The immense difficulty of maintaining this kind of belief led Kierkegaard to assert that true faith is extraordinarily rare and of incomparable worth. Most people prefer the safety of rationality or the reassurance of societal approval over the vulnerability and ambiguity that genuine faith entails. They crave belief, yet recoil from the decisive leap it requires. In Kierkegaard's estimation, this reluctance explains why true Christianity is so uncommon, even in cultures that outwardly identify as Christian. Many settle for a shallow, performative religiosity, unwilling to surrender to the depth of commitment that authentic faith demands. Part 10. The Demonic, the spiritual state of enclosed reserve. Among Søren Kierkegaard's most profound contributions to existential psychology is his analysis of the demonic, a deeply troubled spiritual condition grounded in what he calls shut-upness, or a kind of inwardly locked reserve. This state appears spiritually intense on the surface, but conceals a dangerous inversion, a turning inward that obstructs genuine self-becoming. Although Kierkegaard touches on this theme throughout his work, it finds its most thorough articulation in the concept of anxiety. There, he outlines a particular kind of spiritual dysfunction that arises in individuals who, despite becoming self-aware, actively resist the journey toward authentic personal transformation. In unpacking the nature of the demonic, Kierkegaard demonstrates how spiritual awareness, when distorted, can lead not to freedom, but to a deeply rooted inner imprisonment. This concept provides a powerful framework for interpreting forms of existential and psychological suffering that evade standard ethical or clinical explanations. For Kierkegaard, the demonic is not merely the absence of freedom as seen in innocence or ignorance. It is a far more sinister state, an active, conscious refusal of freedom. In such a condition, the person is fully aware of their capacity for authentic choice, but chooses instead to misdirect or suppress that freedom. This produces a paradoxical form of existence. The person is neither innocently unaware nor genuinely free, but instead sabotages their own freedom inwards. They recognize meaningful possibilities for their life, but lack either the will or the courage to pursue them. Rather than embracing the demands of true spiritual life, they adopt substitute forms that mimic spiritual depth while carefully avoiding its risks. At the heart of this pattern is what Kierkegaard terms shut-upness, a severe and unhealthy inward closure. This is not the discretion of healthy boundaries or privacy, but a deeper spiritual refusal to share one's inner world, emotions, thoughts, and personal struggles with others. This inward barricading ruptures authentic connection, not only with fellow human beings, but with the divine. The demonic self becomes trapped within its own internal space, caught in a recursive loop of isolation that it cannot break. Kierkegaard explores how this inner reserve can manifest in a range of complex and even contradictory behaviors. Some individuals retreat into complete silence, unable or unwilling to articulate their inner turmoil. Others speak excessively, using a flood of words to deflect attention from their true selves. Still others adopt highly indirect modes of communication, paradoxically revealing and concealing at once, appearing transparent while carefully guarding their inner life. This spiritual condition frequently emerges in those who have endured significant psychological or spiritual wounds, traumas they cannot fully process or integrate into a unified sense of self. Rather than confronting their pain or reaching out for help, they recoil into a private inner refuge that ultimately becomes more harmful than healing. While this state of reserve might seem to offer short-term relief from anxiety or social pressure, it eventually shuts the person off from the very relationships and spiritual connections necessary for true restoration. The demonic individual opts for the bitter familiarity of inner paralysis over the vulnerability and uncertainty required for real growth. Kierkegaard outlines a spectrum of demonic awareness, with each level marking a deeper descent into existential peril. The most basic form is unconscious demonic behavior, where the person acts out their turmoil without understanding its source. More dangerous is conscious demonic behavior, in which the individual recognizes their condition yet obstinately refuses to change. The most extreme version is what Kierkegaard calls the demonic with consciousness of evil. Here, the person not only acknowledges their spiritual degradation, but perversely embraces it, deriving a grim satisfaction from their refusal to pursue the good. This represents a radical and willful estrangement from spiritual health. One particularly disturbing aspect of the demonic is its subtle link to creativity. Kierkegaard observes that individuals with great intellectual or artistic talent are sometimes especially prone to this condition. Rather than using their gifts to foster understanding or connection, they create elaborate philosophical systems or powerful works of art that serve to entrench their isolation and deepen their spiritual division. Some people produce work that appears profoundly intelligent and emotionally rich, yet they remain deeply removed from meaningful human connection. Instead of serving as a medium for genuine communion, their creative output becomes a carefully crafted barrier, an elegant silence that conceals their inner distance rather than drawing others near. Søren Kierkegaard's reflections on the demonic illuminate how it is deeply rooted in pride and an obstinate refusal to be helped. Those ensnared by this condition often exhibit profound spiritual insight, yet they resist any acknowledgement of their need for grace, mercy, or the support of others, whether divine or human. Their pride expresses itself through an unwavering insistence on autonomy, a fierce determination to endure life's burdens alone, unwilling to expose themselves to the vulnerability that authentic relationships demand. This posture doesn't represent strength, but rather a form of spiritual exile, an isolation that denies the fundamental interdependence central to human flourishing. Such demonic detachment frequently manifests through compulsive behaviors that masquerade as spiritual devotion. Individuals may become absorbed in elaborate religious practices, intellectual pursuits, or strict moral disciplines that, although outwardly admirable, ultimately function as barriers to true spiritual development. These efforts consume their focus and energy, but serve only to deepen a state of spiritual paralysis. To outsiders, these practices may appear commendable or even exemplary. However, they primarily operate as refined tactics of avoidance, subtle, sophisticated means of evading the internal transformation that genuine spiritual progress requires. The individual becomes trapped in cycles of activity that simulate movement, while their inner life stagnates and remains emotionally and spiritually cut off. Kierkegaard observed that certain professions and social identities are particularly vulnerable to this demonic form of entrapment. Thinkers, clergy, artists, and others whose work is rooted in spiritual or creative expression are especially tempted to hide behind their public personas. They may seem morally discerning or spiritually mature, yet behind the facade, their personal inner life is often withered or distorted. The very gifts meant to nurture sincerity and spiritual depth are co-opted as defenses against the demands of real transformation. The antidote, according to Kierkegaard, lies in what he called revelation, a forceful disruption of the walls the individual has built around themselves. This breakthrough often arrives in the form of crisis, confrontation, or some other jarring event that forces the person to confront their isolation and recognize their need for authentic relationship. It is an uncomfortable, often painful awakening, precisely because it requires abandoning the illusory safety of familiar suffering for the uncertainties of real change. Healing from this condition requires more than intellectual clarity. It demands the courage to become vulnerable again, to re-engage in relationships despite previous wounds and disillusionments. Spiritually, the journey out of the demonic involves realizing that lasting meaning and security cannot be achieved solely through effort or human connection. Ultimately, one must make what Kierkegaard famously called the leap of faith, a deliberate act of surrender that opens the heart to divine grace and the possibility of redemption. This leap necessitates letting go of the pride and illusion of self-sufficiency that sustain the demonic mindset and adopting instead an attitude of reliance on God. Only through this surrender can the soul be freed from its inner captivity. In restoring relationship with the eternal, the individual becomes able to engage in real communication and fellowship with others, finally emerging from the solitude of hiddenness into the liberating reality of authentic spiritual life. Part 11. Love and Marriage. Aesthetic versus Ethical Perspectives in Kierkegaard's Thought. Søren Kierkegaard's insights into love and marriage stand among the most practical and relatable aspects of his existential philosophy. In major works like Either Or and Stages on Life's Way, he explores how different modes of life, the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious, shape our understanding and experience of romantic relationships. These distinct life perspectives give rise to equally distinct kinds of relationships, each with its own implications for personal development, fulfillment, and happiness. Kierkegaard's examination of romantic desire, erotic attraction, and the commitments of marriage illustrates how the stage of life one inhabits determines not only the nature of love, but also its depth and durability. By unpacking these perspectives, we gain important insights into broader existential themes such as authenticity, responsibility, and the foundations of deep human connection. The aesthetic perspective views love primarily through the lens of pleasure, emotional intensity, and the thrill of novelty. For someone living aesthetically, romantic love is largely defined by enchantment with appearances, the pursuit of charm, and the euphoric highs that come with new infatuation. Love, in this context, becomes a form of emotional entertainment, an experience sought for its ability to stimulate and delight, rather than to endure or transform. Within this mindset, the idea of commitment often appears as a threat. It is seen as a limit to freedom, a dampener of excitement, and the beginning of monotony. Kierkegaard critiques this fragile model of love, showing that it depends too heavily on transient emotions and surface-level attraction, making it inherently unstable and destined to falter. Because aesthetic love is rooted in momentary feelings and external allure, it tends to fade once the initial excitement gives way to routine. As the extraordinary becomes ordinary, the aesthetic lover faces a dilemma: either remain in a now lifeless relationship or chase the spark elsewhere. Yet both paths end in frustration. Staying leads to emotional emptiness, while leaving in search of new thrills prevents the development of meaningful, lasting bonds. Worse still, the aesthetic approach often reduces the beloved to a mere object of gratification, overlooking their individuality and intrinsic worth. Rather than truly loving the other person, the aesthetic individual falls in love with the feelings the other inspires. This inward focus creates a disconnect, isolating the lover within their own emotional experience and preventing genuine relational depth. As soon as the beloved's real, imperfect self begins to show, shattering the idealized image, the illusion breaks. Disappointment sets in, and the relationship often collapses under the weight of unmet expectations and emotional disorientation. By contrast, the ethical approach to love and marriage represents a meaningful progression. This perspective introduces essential qualities such as fidelity, responsibility, and a sincere commitment to the other person's well-being. The ethical individual understands that real love is not just a feeling, but a conscious decision, one that involves embracing another person through all of life's changes and uncertainties. From this standpoint, marriage is no longer a romantic fantasy, but a moral calling, a solemn partnership built on mutual duty and enduring promise, even when those promises are difficult to keep. The ethical lover commits to cultivating qualities like devotion, patience, and sacrificial care. These virtues form the structural core of a resilient and ethically sound relationship. Kierkegaard's pseudonymous character, Judge William, serves as a voice for this ethical stance in its fullest form. He advocates for marriage as the highest ethical commitment, suggesting that through such a relationship, one achieves a sense of continuity and becomes capable of forming truly authentic human connections. In ethical marriage, romantic passion is not eliminated, but reoriented, anchored in shared values and a unified life direction. Rather than seeking constant emotional peaks, the ethical couple builds their relationship on mutual respect, shared moral purpose, and a long-term dedication to one another's growth. Kierkegaard emphasizes the superiority of this model over the aesthetic alternative. Ethical love offers emotional stability, genuine partnership, and the potential for deep, life-changing intimacy, gifts that fleeting passions can never provide. Moreover, this ethical view brings with it a distinct kind of joy, the fulfillment of keeping promises, the satisfaction of living responsibly, and the richness of building something enduring with another person. The ethical lover gains access to forms of happiness that lie beyond the reach of the aesthetic, the quiet, lasting joy of putting another's needs above one's own, the trust that deepens over time, and the shared sense of purpose that turns love into a lifelong commitment. Kierkegaard recognized the limitations of interpreting love and marriage solely through an ethical framework. When these bonds are reduced to mere obligations or societal expectations, they risk becoming hollow performances, externally respectable, yet lacking the depth and vitality of genuine emotional connection. A relationship based entirely on ethical duty might satisfy traditional norms, but it can miss the spiritual richness that gives love its highest meaning. Couples may achieve outward success in marriage, adhering to accepted standards, yet never touch the kind of transformative love that elevates the soul and echoes into eternity. In contrast, Kierkegaard argued that the religious understanding of love represents the most profound and complete expression of human intimacy. This view roots love not in cultural customs or moral codes, but in a divine foundation that reshapes how individuals relate to one another. To love within a religious context is to perceive the beloved as a person created and treasured by God, a realization that changes the very nature of the relationship. Importantly, The religious perspective does not reject either the aesthetic pleasure of romantic attraction or the moral obligations of ethical commitment. Instead, it places both within a larger spiritual story, one in which love finds its ultimate purpose in communion with the eternal. A religious lover is not only capable of cherishing beauty and honoring commitment, but also of recognizing both the beloved and the relationship itself as sacred gifts. These are not possessions to be owned, but trusts to be tended with care and humility. Crucially, this spiritual view of love brings something essential that purely aesthetic or ethical models lack: the power of forgiveness. Forgiveness is what enables love to survive when confronted by human imperfection and failure. Romantic love, grounded in idealized visions, often falters when reality breaks the illusion. Ethical love may persist out of a sense of obligation, but it can grow distant or bitter when one partner fails to meet moral standards. Only religious love contains the spiritual depth to offer true forgiveness, a forgiveness that not only endures hardship but transforms it. Because it acknowledges the fallibility of both individuals and their mutual need for divine grace, religious love can extend mercy where human strength alone would fail. This opens the path to reconciliation and renewal, even after profound disillusionment. In such moments, couples may experience what Kierkegaard called repetition, a rekindling of love that has been tested, purified, and renewed through the healing force of forgiveness. Kierkegaard's personal experience, especially his broken engagement to Regine Olsen, adds a deeply emotional layer to his philosophical reflections on love and marriage. His decision to end the engagement seems rooted in his belief that he could not fully live out the demands of true marital love while remaining faithful to his spiritual and intellectual calling. Whether this choice reflects a profound spiritual insight or a tragic personal failing remains a matter of scholarly debate. Nonetheless, it profoundly shaped his understanding of the tension between romantic devotion and religious vocation. His inner conflict illuminates the complex and painful challenges that arise when romantic, ethical, and spiritual commitments intersect, and sometimes clash. These tensions remain relevant today in a world where many people approach love and marriage with a mix of emotional idealism and pragmatic expectations. Modern couples often hope for both constant passion and stable companionship. When reality fails to meet these dual desires, they face the same dilemma Kierkegaard identified: retreat into romantic fantasy or persist through mere obligation. Kierkegaard's writings suggest a third path, one grounded in a religious conception of love that transcends both fleeting emotion and rigid duty. Such a foundation, anchored in divine love, provides the spiritual resources needed for forgiveness, transformation, and enduring growth. It is this deep spiritual anchoring that allows love not only to survive, but to thrive, renewed, tested, and made stronger over time. Part 12. The Concept of Irony. Kierkegaard's Socratic Method. Søren Kierkegaard developed irony into one of his most sophisticated philosophical instruments, shaped heavily by his deep engagement with the legacy of Socrates. For Kierkegaard, irony was not just a rhetorical flourish, but a transformative mechanism, both intellectually provocative and spiritually awakening. His doctoral thesis, which focuses entirely on the theme of irony and its continual engagement with the figure of Socrates, places this concept at the center of his philosophical approach and lays the groundwork for what he would later call indirect communication. Kierkegaard's understanding of irony is closely tied to his efforts to bypass the limitations of direct discourse, particularly in matters of spiritual and existential importance. Instead of offering fixed doctrines or straightforward answers, he employs irony to create a reflective space where true understanding must arise from within. In this way, irony functions not only as a literary device, but also as a means of awakening individuals to live more consciously and truthfully. He identifies multiple forms of irony, each tailored to a specific purpose within his broader philosophical and theological framework. Speculative irony is aimed at dismantling abstract systems and philosophical constructs by exposing their inconsistencies and shortcomings. Existential irony draws attention to the gap between what people claim to believe and how they actually live, unmasking the self-deceptions hidden in daily routines. Romantic irony, meanwhile, operates as a deliberate narrative strategy, where the author manipulates the form and voice of the text to elicit a particular engagement from the reader. Central to all of these, however, is Socratic irony, the foundational model for Kierkegaard's entire ironic method. Socrates famously employed a method of pretending ignorance, using humble questioning to undermine the false certainties of those who claimed to possess wisdom. By asking seemingly naive questions, he exposed the fragility of their assumptions and the confusion underlying their views on essential subjects. This approach was far more than sarcasm or rhetorical trickery. It was a deeply effective tool for intellectual clarity and spiritual insight. Kierkegaard adopted and deepened this approach, seeing in Socratic irony a remarkable power to initiate genuine self-examination, rather than impose conclusions about faith, ethics, or existence. Kierkegaard's ironic method challenges his readers to confront their own assumptions and develop their own convictions. In doing so, he affirms the individual's freedom and responsibility, offering guidance that is both demanding and liberating. For him, irony serves as a clearing mechanism. It dismantles easy certainties and invites the reader into a space where true decisions and authentic commitments can take shape. This method becomes particularly significant when dealing with existential or religious truth, which cannot be conveyed like factual information. If spiritual truths are handed over in a purely didactic fashion, they risk being accepted intellectually without triggering the inner transformation that genuine faith requires. Kierkegaard's use of irony deliberately frustrates such passive reception, introducing ambiguity and uncertainty that drive the reader to wrestle with these questions on their own terms. Such personal struggle is not a side effect, but a necessary step in authentic spiritual development. Truths of deep existential value must be owned internally, not merely understood conceptually. Kierkegaard's most intricate application of irony is found in his use of pseudonyms, fictional authors through whom he explores different perspectives. Each pseudonym presents its own voice, worldview, and philosophical or spiritual stance, allowing Kierkegaard to detach himself from the ideas expressed and avoid becoming an unquestioned authority. This narrative strategy obliges the reader to engage with the ideas on their own, without relying on Kierkegaard's personal endorsement. Each pseudonymous author offers a distinct existential outlook, complete with its own insights and blind spots. This structure creates a dynamic form of dramatic irony. Authors writing from an aesthetic point of view may celebrate pleasure and artistic beauty, yet remain unaware of the spiritual emptiness at the core of their lives. Ethical authors who stress duty and moral responsibility often miss the inadequacies of human-centered ethics when it comes to ultimate meaning. Even the religious pseudonyms sometimes reflect imperfect or transitional stages of faith, underscoring the difficulty of reaching authentic spiritual conviction. Through this elaborate and multi-layered use of irony, Kierkegaard is able to explore a range of human perspectives with both empathy and critical insight. His method encourages not just intellectual understanding, but existential engagement. Readers are called to respond actively, to examine their own lives, and to assume full responsibility for the beliefs they come to hold. To develop genuine discernment, readers must learn to value diverse viewpoints while also recognizing the limitations inherent in each. This kind of intellectual and spiritual engagement moves beyond passively absorbing ideas or accepting moral dogma. It prioritizes personal insight and thoughtful judgment. Irony, rather than dictating what to believe, becomes a vehicle for nurturing critical reflection on life's deeper concerns. Søren Kierkegaard uses irony as a subtle but powerful tool to reveal the contradictions and self-deceptions that often underpin people's professed ethical or spiritual convictions. By employing an indirect style, he draws attention to the disjunction between abstract ideals and actual behavior, without falling into the trap of direct accusation. This gentle approach fosters introspection rather than defensiveness. Blunt criticism can easily provoke resistance, making individuals less open to honest self-examination. Irony, by contrast, creates a space where people are invited to recognize their own inconsistencies and then decide, on their own terms, how to respond. Kierkegaard's strategy relies on the interplay between irony and humor. True irony often evokes a bittersweet laugh, one that arises when people see themselves reflected in a satirical or paradoxical narrative. Such laughter does not trivialize the weight of the subject. Rather, it softens the emotional terrain, making it easier for individuals to examine themselves with sincerity. The ability to laugh at one's own illusions can become a gateway to authentic transformation. However, Kierkegaard was acutely aware of the dangers that come with irony when it is not used with care. When irony functions purely as a tool of criticism, tearing down beliefs without offering anything to take their place, it can descend into cynicism or even nihilism. The ironist may end up trapped in a cycle of perpetual deconstruction, unable or unwilling to make meaningful commitments. This is one reason why Kierkegaard eventually moved away from relying solely on ironic communication, turning instead to more direct and earnest modes of expression in his later religious works. At its heart, Kierkegaardian irony is not destructive, but revelatory. Its purpose is to break down false certainties and pave the way for authentic understanding and genuine commitment. Like the Socratic method, it induces what Kierkegaard called a beneficial confusion, a kind of disorienting clarity that sparks real growth and learning. The ultimate goal is not to mire individuals in doubt, but to cultivate the intellectual and spiritual maturity required for true dedication. In this sense, irony becomes a form of spiritual midwifery. It helps individuals give birth to their own convictions, rather than spoon-feeding them ready-made truths. Kierkegaard's ironic method holds enduring relevance, especially in today's landscape of shallow spirituality and intellectual complacency. In a culture overwhelmed by information and often dominated by superficial religious and philosophical cliches, irony remains a vital instrument for prompting sincere personal reflection. Its capacity to reveal contradictions and illusions through indirect means still offers a powerful route toward spiritual clarity. Understanding the intricacies of Kierkegaardian irony not only sharpens our ability to engage in meaningful spiritual discourse, it also helps us discern substance from slogan, authenticity from manipulation, and depth from mere performance. Part 13. The Genius and the Apostle. Kierkegaard's enduring influence. Among Søren Kierkegaard's most significant philosophical insights is his distinction between the genius and the apostle, a nuanced examination of spiritual authority's true origin and nature. The genius symbolizes the zenith of human achievement, recognized for their intellectual prowess, creativity, and contributions within the realm of human capability. This type of greatness is subject to reason, critique, and admiration. A genius earns recognition by engaging the human mind, whether through artistic innovation, scientific discovery, or ethical insight. Their brilliance is grasped, evaluated, and appreciated by others through the lens of human understanding. Crucially, the genius does not claim authority beyond what human judgment can assess or affirm. The apostle, however, operates on an entirely different basis. Unlike the genius, the apostle's authority is not rooted in personal intellect or moral achievement, but stems from a divine mandate. Rather than offering insights from personal reflection, the apostle speaks with the weight of divine revelation. This message, inherently transcendent, defies human reasoning and lies outside the scope of intellectual verification. This sharp contrast unveils a foundational tension in how religious authority is perceived. Authentic religious authority requires faith, not logical demonstration or empirical validation. Yet such authority must be communicated to individuals who naturally seek evidence and rational explanation. When the lines between genius and apostle are blurred, significant errors often follow. Treating religious leaders primarily as intellectual authorities risks reducing religion to a sophisticated form of philosophy rather than a vehicle of divine truth. Conversely, when individuals with remarkable intelligence or creative power are mistaken for apostles, their insights, however valuable, can be wrongly treated as sacred truths. This misattribution elevates human brilliance to a divine status, distorting both theology and practice. Recognizing the essential difference between genius and apostle reveals why authentic faith cannot be grounded solely in rational thought. It also highlights the vital role of spiritual discernment in navigating religious life with integrity. Kierkegaard's philosophical influence extends far beyond the intellectual currents of the 19th century. Widely regarded as the father of existentialism, his reflections on freedom, despair, and authentic existence deeply impacted later thinkers such as Jean-Paul Sartre, Martin Heidegger, and Gabriel Marcel, even when these thinkers worked within secular or atheistic frameworks. His treatment of anxiety anticipated psychological insights that would not formally emerge until much later. By framing anxiety as a core aspect of what it means to be human, rather than a pathology, Kierkegaard laid foundational ideas for modern psychotherapy. Many of today's therapeutic approaches, which emphasize authenticity, self-discovery, and personal accountability, owe much to his pioneering thought. In theology, Kierkegaard's critiques of institutional religion and his call for individual faith influenced major 20th century theologians, including Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. His technique of indirect communication reshaped educational thinking, encouraging an approach that fosters active learning and personal engagement over passive absorption of information. Kierkegaard's insights into societal trends, particularly his warnings about the homogenizing power of the public and the sway of popular opinion, anticipated many modern critiques of mass media, consumer culture, and the erosion of individual identity. His commentary on the press strikingly foreshadows today's discussions around social media and its psychological impact. His literary legacy also endures. Writers such as Franz Kafka, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and William Orton drew from Kierkegaard's methods of indirect communication and his exploration of existential fear and individuality. His emphasis on personal responsibility has shaped contemporary moral philosophy and political thought, contributing to ongoing discussions about moral education and democratic life. In many respects, Kierkegaard's relevance has only increased in the face of modern complexity and cultural volatility. His concept of anxiety as stemming from boundless possibility resonates with contemporary struggles such as decision fatigue and the paralysis caused by too many choices. His philosophy offers practical frameworks for managing the challenges of contemporary existence, dilemmas that, ironically, he could not have fully foreseen. Above all, Kierkegaard's insights into what it means to make authentic choices continue to speak powerfully to modern readers. Whether navigating professional crossroads, personal relationships, or significant life changes, his ideas offer clarity and depth. His famous portrayal of anxiety as the dizziness of freedom reframes inner turmoil not as failure, but as a natural byproduct of human freedom and the responsibility it entails. By emphasizing the importance of personal experience and the pursuit of subjective truth, Kierkegaard presents a powerful response to both rigid dogmatism and the paralyzing ambiguity of relativism in addressing life's most profound questions. His philosophical insights into the conflict between individual authenticity and societal expectations, the interplay between objective facts and subjective understanding, and the effort to bridge the finite with the infinite continue to hold deep relevance in contemporary thought. Kierkegaard remains vital today because the existential issues he examined are still at the heart of human existence. His work continues to inspire those seeking clarity on identity, meaning, and how to lead an authentic life. Rather than offering easy answers, his legacy lies in encouraging successive generations to ask more penetrating questions and to face life's enduring struggles with greater honesty and moral courage. Arguably, his most lasting insight is the recognition that the core questions of existence cannot be answered through abstract reasoning alone. They require a committed, truthful way of living, an acceptance of life's uncertainties, and the courage to move forward without the comfort of absolute certainty. Part 14. The Knight of Faith. Abraham as the embodiment of unconditional devotion. In Fear and Trembling, Søren Kierkegaard casts the biblical patriarch Abraham as the quintessential figure of what he terms the Knight of Faith. Through a close reading of the narrative in which Abraham is instructed to sacrifice his beloved son, Isaac, Kierkegaard probes into the loftiest expression of religious life, a state marked by profound paradox and total surrender. In this philosophical investigation, Kierkegaard exposes the deep internal contradictions that define authentic faith. His reflections reveal that such faith is exceedingly rare and demands extraordinary inner strength. The Knight of Faith, a concept he develops, represents the apex of spiritual evolution, a figure who remains enigmatic and unreachable to the vast majority. The story of Abraham and Isaac portrays a scenario that cannot be resolved within the limits of conventional morality. When Abraham receives the divine command to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, he is faced with a situation that dismantles standard ethical reasoning. From a moral perspective grounded in human norms, the idea of killing one's own child is utterly reprehensible, an unforgivable breach of paternal duty and human decency. Yet Abraham does not weigh God's command against human ethics. He perceives it as operating on a plane that transcends moral categories. To underscore the uniqueness of Abraham's act, Kierkegaard contrasts him with the tragic hero, figures like Agamemnon, who sacrifices his daughter Iphigenia for the sake of national salvation. Such tragic decisions, while deeply painful, are still comprehensible within a framework of ethical reasoning or collective interest. Agamemnon's sacrifice, though grievous, is intelligible as a form of noble self-denial for a public good. Abraham's obedience, by contrast, resists any such moral interpretation. His readiness to kill Isaac is not motivated by service to a higher ethical law or a communal benefit. There is no justifying principle, no public cause that renders his action intelligible. On the contrary, his act seems to nullify the very covenant in which God promised to make Abraham the father of a great people through Isaac. What renders Abraham's faith so radical is its resistance to ethical justification and its inability to be communicated. This silence, the impossibility of explaining or defending his actions, is central to the concept of the Knight of Faith. Abraham is entirely alone in his ordeal. He cannot explain his decision to Sarah, to Isaac, or to anyone else. He offers no rationale for the journey to Mount Moriah, nor does he attempt to understand why God would demand such a terrible act. The Knight of Faith exists in utter solitude, sustained by convictions that cannot be translated into shared language or mutual understanding. These inner beliefs surpass the reach of ordinary comprehension. Yet Abraham's stance is not simply blind obedience. Kierkegaard draws a vital distinction between two spiritual figures, the Knight of infinite resignation and the Knight of Faith, both of whom Abraham embodies. As the Knight of resignation, Abraham is prepared to surrender all he loves, accepting that God may require the ultimate loss. But as the Knight of Faith, he goes a step further, trusting that what he sacrifices will, in some unfathomable way, be returned to him. This dual movement lies at the core of Abraham's paradoxical trust. Though ready to give up Isaac entirely, he also believes, without evidence or precedent, that God will restore him. Such a belief cannot be explained by logic, experience, or any rational process. Abraham believes, as Kierkegaard puts it, by virtue of the absurd. His hope defies every natural expectation, clinging to the impossible even in the face of a divine command to destroy what he cherishes most. The paradox intensifies when one considers Abraham's relationship to time and possibility. He does not depend on a last-minute reprieve or hope for divine reconsideration. Instead, he holds the unshakable conviction that even if the sacrifice is completed and Isaac dies, God will still fulfill the promise. This belief contradicts not only rational thought, but the very principles of nature and human experience. And yet, it is precisely this inconceivable trust that establishes Abraham as the father of faith, a model of absolute religious dedication. By responding to a divine command that runs counter to all ethical norms, Abraham demonstrates a devotion that places God's authority above human judgment. Simultaneously, his unwavering belief in the promise, despite every indication to the contrary, reveals the extraordinary power of faith to transcend the limits of reason, time, and human understanding. Abraham's greatness does not stem from moral excellence or ethical conduct, but from an intimate, enigmatic relationship with God. This unique kind of devotion, what Kierkegaard describes as the night of faith, stands apart from both the aesthetic and ethical modes of life. The aesthetic person seeks pleasure, novelty, and personal enjoyment, while the ethical individual strives to live by universal moral codes and societal duties. In contrast, the night of faith transcends both paths, anchoring all meaning in a solitary and absolute commitment to the divine, an allegiance that frequently resists rational explanation. What distinguishes the night of faith is the paradox of their simplicity. Unlike the tragic hero, whose moral significance is publicly recognized through noble acts of sacrifice or suffering, the knight of faith lives quietly and inconspicuously. They go about their daily routines, uphold obligations, maintain relationships, and present themselves as ordinary. Yet beneath this surface lies a hidden, profound relationship with the eternal, known only to God and to themselves. Their faith, though radical in nature, remains invisible to the outside world. This hiddenness is not accidental, it is essential. True faith, for Kierkegaard, requires no external affirmation. The knight of faith does not seek recognition or praise because their sense of purpose and strength arises entirely from their inward connection to the divine. Though they participate fully in the world, finding joy, forming bonds, meeting responsibilities, they do not depend on these experiences for ultimate meaning. Having made the leap into faith, they exist in a dual reality, grounded in both time and eternity, shaped by both the finite and the infinite, embodying both individuality and universality. A key element of this spiritual condition is what Kierkegaard refers to as repetition, the wondrous restoration of what has been relinquished. For Abraham, the return of Isaac is not simply the recovery of a son, but a revelation of divine mercy. This return does not erase the anguish of sacrifice. Rather, it transforms its significance. In the realm of faith, the knight does not reject the world, but reclaims it, now illuminated by sacred understanding. Material goods and human relationships are not abandoned, but are embraced anew, placed within their rightful context and subordinate to God. Nonetheless, Kierkegaard insists that such a form of faith is extraordinarily rare and demands extraordinary resolve. Few possess the inner strength to relinquish the comfort of rational clarity or the security of ethical norms. Even those who desire faith often settle for surface-level religiosity, avoiding the intense isolation and existential uncertainty that genuine faith requires. The Knight of Faith challenges such complacency, calling for a total transformation of how one engages with life itself. Writing under the pseudonym Johannes de Silentio, Kierkegaard openly confesses his doubt about whether he is capable of embodying the faith he so admires in Abraham. He does not present himself as an exemplar, but as a respectful onlooker, one who marvels at Abraham's spiritual stature while recognizing his own limitations. This humble admission reflects Kierkegaard's belief that true faith cannot be achieved through intellect or effort alone. It is a divine bestowal, a radical and unmerited act of grace that reshapes existence in ways that elude reason, control, and full comprehension. Part 15. Subjective Truth versus Objective Truth. The Heart of True Understanding. One of the most revolutionary contributions of Søren Kierkegaard's philosophy is his distinction between objective and subjective truth, a concept that redefined how we relate knowledge to lived experience. By challenging the prevailing emphasis on objectivity, Kierkegaard redirected philosophical attention toward the inner, personal dimensions of truth. He argued that the most profound truths about human existence cannot be reached through detached observation or scientific reasoning. Understanding this difference is essential to grasping Kierkegaard's overall philosophical project, which includes his critique of academic philosophy and institutionalized Christianity. For Kierkegaard, genuine insight requires personal involvement rather than dispassionate analysis. Objective truth refers to knowledge that is universally valid, truths that can be confirmed by empirical evidence, logical reasoning, or scientific inquiry. This kind of truth aims to transcend individual perspectives by eliminating personal bias and emotional investment, thereby reaching conclusions that any rational person could accept, regardless of their particular context or experience. Kierkegaard did not reject objective truth outright. He acknowledged its vital role in domains such as mathematics, the natural sciences, and historical research. In these areas, objective investigation is not only appropriate but indispensable. Yet, when it comes to questions of existence, questions about who we are, why we live, and what we believe, objectivity proves insufficient. These are not problems that can be resolved from a distance. They demand the full engagement of the self, including one's values, choices, and commitments. Here, Kierkegaard introduced the notion of subjective truth, which centers on the personal relationship between the individual and what they hold as meaningful or true. Importantly, subjective truth is not the same as relativism or arbitrary belief. It does not mean that any belief is equally valid. Rather, Kierkegaard's idea emphasizes that certain truths can only be known through deep personal investment. In matters of faith, ethics, and purpose, what matters is not just what is believed, but how it is believed, whether the belief is lived, embodied, and transformative. When Kierkegaard declared that truth is subjectivity, he wasn't denying the reality of facts or promoting opinion over evidence. Instead, he was asserting that in areas of ultimate concern, the authenticity and intensity of one's commitment are more important than objective verification. A person who dedicates their life to a belief that cannot be scientifically proven may possess a richer kind of truth than someone who merely acknowledges facts without emotional or existential engagement. In Kierkegaard's view, subjective truth opens up a dimension of human experience that eludes the purely rational mind. His insistence on this point was a direct response to the dominant philosophical traditions of his time. Kierkegaard was especially critical of thinkers like Hegel and other German idealists who attempted to construct comprehensive philosophical systems capable of explaining all of reality through logic. He believed such efforts, however impressive, ultimately failed to capture the lived reality of being human. We are not abstract categories in a logical framework. We are individuals marked by uncertainty, passion, and choice. Human existence, for Kierkegaard, is defined by struggle, commitment, and the constant demand to make meaningful choices. These aspects of life resist full expression in systematic or objective terms. This contrast between objective and subjective truth becomes particularly significant when applied to religion. Traditional religious apologetics often attempt to prove the existence of God using rational arguments or historical data, treating belief as if it were a form of objective knowledge. Kierkegaard saw this as a fundamental misunderstanding of faith. Even if God's existence could be demonstrated with absolute certainty, such a proof would render faith unnecessary. Religion would become just another intellectual pursuit, rather than a lived, transformative experience. Kierkegaard insisted that true religious belief depends not on evidence, but on passionate, inward commitment. The essential question is not whether God can be proven, but whether one chooses to live as if God exists, with trust, risk, and wholehearted devotion. In this understanding, faith transcends a purely intellectual agreement with religious doctrines. It is a deeply personal, existential commitment to what one holds to be ultimately real. It calls for the believer to surrender their entire self to something that cannot be definitively proven through empirical evidence. At the core of authentic faith lies this very element of risk. Søren Kierkegaard illustrated this dynamic in his analysis of how individuals relate to Christianity. A person might master theological concepts, demonstrating a clear and accurate understanding of Christian doctrine, yet never truly experience faith. On the other hand, someone with little academic or theological training might live with fervent devotion to Christ and, through this commitment, grasp a more profound spiritual reality. The difference between these individuals is not found in the extent of their theological knowledge, but in how deeply and passionately they internalize and live out that understanding. This principle extends beyond religious belief and touches all of life's most significant questions. Issues concerning how to live, what to value, and what makes life meaningful cannot be resolved through detached intellectual analysis alone. Rather, such questions require active, personal engagement. They call on us to immerse ourselves, to experiment with our lives, and to commit in ways that transform us. Truths related to morality, beauty, and life's purpose reveal themselves only to those who have the courage to live in alignment with their convictions, even when certainty is out of reach. Kierkegaard described two distinct kinds of reflection that align with these different approaches to truth. The first, known as objective reflection, strives for an impartial, universal perspective by distancing the thinker from the subject of inquiry. The second, subjective reflection, acknowledges that the individual is inseparable from the process of understanding, and that their personal involvement fundamentally shapes both the inquiry and its conclusions. When it comes to existential matters, subjective reflection is not a flaw to be eliminated, but an essential gateway to authentic insight. For Kierkegaard, accessing subjective truth requires what he termed inwardness, a profound deepening of personal commitment and emotional and spiritual investment in ultimate questions. This inwardness cannot be acquired through external knowledge or societal approval. It emerges only when one resolves to live in accordance with their deepest beliefs and willingly embraces the uncertainty that accompanies such a decision. The more this inwardness is cultivated, the more meaningful and transformative the subjective truth becomes, even if the beliefs it involves cannot be empirically verified. Kierkegaard's emphasis on subjective truth also sheds light on his preference for indirect communication and his use of pseudonyms. If the most vital truths cannot simply be transmitted like scientific data, then the task of the writer is to provoke the reader into engaging with these truths personally. Rather than presenting conclusions to be passively absorbed, Kierkegaard creates literary scenarios that force the reader to confront life-defining choices and take existential responsibility. Only those who are prepared to grapple with these questions on a personal level, not merely understand them intellectually, can genuinely apprehend their truth. However, Kierkegaard's advocacy for subjective truth should not be mistaken as a rejection of objective reality or an embrace of relativism. He maintained that not all subjective commitments are equally valid. Some reflect a deeper honesty and greater existential seriousness than others. Authentic subjectivity, in his view, involves an obligation to something greater than one's own preferences. The highest expression of this lies in a personal relationship with God, who embodies absolute truth. While this relationship requires a subjective leap of faith, it is also rooted in an objective reality. Here, Kierkegaard introduces a striking paradox. The most deeply personal truth is simultaneously the most universal. In encountering the absolute, the individual connects with a truth that transcends personal opinion, one that must be individually lived and embraced, yet remains grounded in something objectively real. Part 16. Despair and the Sickness unto Death, revealing the human predicament. Søren Kierkegaard's treatment of despair, what he famously calls the sickness unto death, ranks among the most penetrating analyses of the human condition in the philosophical canon. He does not regard despair as a passing emotional state or a reaction to specific life events, but as a pervasive existential reality embedded in the very structure of human existence. It is, for him, a universal affliction, one that touches every person, whether they are conscious of it or not. Understanding Kierkegaard's conception of despair is essential for grasping his broader vision of human life and the path to authentic selfhood. His reflections remain profoundly relevant in our time, particularly as we grapple with crises of identity, existential uncertainty, and mental health. Despair, in his philosophy, should not be mistaken for mere melancholy, discouragement, or emotional pain in response to misfortune. Instead, it reflects a fundamental disunity within the self, a spiritual malady that affects the deepest layers of our being. To appreciate this, we must begin with Kierkegaard's notion of the self. He famously defines the self as a relation that relates itself to itself, and also as something that must relate itself to a power beyond itself. This formulation reveals a central idea. The self is not a static entity, but a dynamic process, a synthesis of opposites. Human beings are composed of contrasting elements, the finite and the infinite, necessity and possibility, temporality and eternity. Our lives unfold in the midst of these tensions, between what we already are and what we might become, between the concrete facts of our existence and the transcendent possibilities that call us beyond them. In this view, the self is not a given, but a task, something to be continually forged through the ongoing reconciliation of life's paradoxes. Despair arises when this synthesis breaks down, when the balance between opposing dimensions is lost. A person might become overly immersed in the finite, in daily routines, societal expectations, or surface-level pleasures, thus cutting themselves off from the higher possibilities of existence. Conversely, one might become entangled in the infinite, absorbed in fantasies, dreams, or abstract ideals, while ignoring the practical limitations and obligations of their real-world circumstances. This leads to a kind of existential escapism, a refusal to engage with one's concrete life. In both cases, the individual fails to integrate the polarities of existence into a coherent and authentic self. What makes Kierkegaard's insight particularly compelling is his recognition of how elusive despair can be. He insists that the most dangerous form of despair is not the one we suffer consciously, but the one we fail to notice at all. Many people live in quiet conformity, adhering to social norms and external benchmarks, all while remaining disconnected from their own deepest self. They avoid inner confrontation and the anxiety that comes with genuine freedom by choosing comfort, distraction, or passive compliance. Such lives may appear externally successful, yet inwardly they are hollow, lacking spiritual depth and true vitality. This unconscious despair manifests in many ways. Some drown themselves in sensory pleasures and trivial entertainments to avoid reflecting on life's deeper meaning. Others build their entire identity around external roles, titles, careers, social image, effectively abandoning any connection with their inner self. Still others retreat into intellectualism, approaching life as a subject to analyze rather than an experience to live. They become spectators rather than participants, turning existence into an abstract puzzle instead of a lived reality. Kierkegaard categorizes despair into three primary types, based on one's level of self-awareness and attitude toward their condition. The first is despair without awareness, a state in which the individual has no realization of their inner fragmentation. The second is conscious despair, where the person recognizes their condition but refuses to confront it with sincerity. They may attempt to repress it, distract themselves, or live in denial rather than take responsibility for their spiritual misalignment. The third and gravest form is conscious despair that is embraced willfully. An individual who fully understands their despair yet defiantly chooses to remain in it. This state represents a person who rebels against existence itself, against God, truth, or the demands of authentic life, and asserts their despair as a mode of self-will. These stages represent not just increasing levels of self-awareness, but also escalating existential risk. Unconscious despair is insidious and numbing. It erodes the self quietly. Conscious despair marks a painful awakening, a recognition of spiritual disarray. But willful despair is the most dangerous of all. It involves a deliberate rejection of the path to healing and wholeness. Kierkegaard sees this final form as the ultimate spiritual rebellion, a refusal to become who one truly is meant to be. Crucially, Kierkegaard does not treat despair as a merely psychological affliction. For him, it is a deeply spiritual condition, rooted in our fundamental relation to ourselves, to other people, and to the divine. It speaks to the failure not only to live well, but to live truthfully, to bring into unity the fragmented parts of our existence, and to answer the call of our higher nature. While despair may resemble clinical depression in its outward symptoms, its roots lie not in psychological imbalances, but in one's spiritual orientation. Specifically, the individual's relationship to God and their sense of eternal purpose. Kierkegaard argues that the self is not complete unless it relates both to itself and to the divine source from which it originates. He identifies this source as God and contends that despair emerges when a person tries to construct their identity independently of this foundational relationship. This spiritual framework explains why worldly accomplishments, whether they take the form of career success, pleasure, or even ethical living, are ultimately insufficient to dispel despair. A person may attain every indicator of a prosperous life, from financial abundance to widespread admiration, yet still be gripped by an existential despair rooted in a disconnection from their deeper spiritual identity. Conversely, someone who lacks external success or appears to struggle in societal terms may nonetheless overcome despair by cultivating a genuine relationship with God. The resolution of despair, according to Kierkegaard, does not come from changing external situations, but from transforming one's entire outlook on existence. His analysis suggests that despair is not an unusual or rare state, but a fundamental aspect of the human experience. Just as a physician might claim that no person is entirely free of physical ailments, Kierkegaard maintains that every individual harbors some form of internal unrest. Beneath the surface of daily life lies a subtle but persistent dissonance, a sense of unease or conflict that defies easy explanation. This universal condition stems from the very nature of human existence, which calls each person to consciously and freely become their authentic self. The potential to become a true self, however, also entails the possibility of failing to do so. Kierkegaard links despair intimately with sin, presenting them as two expressions of the same spiritual disorder. Despair is the inner, emotional manifestation of what theology defines as sin, a disruption in the self's relationship with itself and with God. In both cases, the individual attempts to assert independence from the divine structure within which real selfhood becomes possible. Despite the gravity of this condition, Kierkegaard offers a hopeful path forward. The solution to despair is not found in superficial happiness or worldly achievement, but in faith. Faith, for Kierkegaard, is the embodiment of true selfhood. It involves entering into a right relationship with God and accepting existence as simultaneously finite and eternal. This transformation requires what he famously calls a leap of faith, a deliberate, personal commitment to ground one's being in something that surpasses human reason and control. The journey out of despair unfolds in several essential stages. First, one must come to recognize the presence of despair, a recognition that surface-level fulfillment may be masking a profound spiritual emptiness. The second step involves accepting that this condition cannot be healed through human strength alone, but requires a connection to something transcendent. The final step is the leap of faith itself, through which the person entrusts their existence to divine grace rather than their own achievements or social approval. Kierkegaard's exploration makes it clear that he did not separate psychological insight from religious truth. He believed that the deepest struggles of human life cannot be resolved by therapy, education, or political reform alone, though these may offer temporary relief. Lasting restoration, he argued, demands a spiritual awakening and a readiness to meet the conditions that make authentic selfhood possible. Only by aligning oneself with the eternal can a person unite the finite and the infinite within their being, achieving the inner harmony that characterizes a true self, and thus finding real freedom from despair. Part 17. Irony and Indirect Communication. The Art of Spiritual Awakening. Søren Kierkegaard developed one of the most sophisticated and influential theories of communication in the history of philosophy. He recognized that the most profound truths, especially those related to human existence and spiritual life, cannot be communicated in the same way as scientific facts or mathematical formulas. His emphasis on irony and indirect communication reveals a crucial insight. Spiritual and existential truths must be discovered through personal experience, not simply taught or stated. This approach marked a significant departure in both educational theory and philosophical discourse. It transformed the role of teaching from the mere transmission of information into a process of guiding inward transformation. At the same time, it shifted how knowledge itself is understood, particularly in its connection to lived reality. To truly understand Kierkegaard's communicative method, one must explore why he wrote under numerous pseudonyms and why his writings often seem contradictory or paradoxical. At the heart of his approach is the distinctive character of existential truth. Ethical and religious truths are not detached abstractions to be handed down. Rather, they must be grasped through what Kierkegaard described as double reflection. A person can easily comprehend religious or spiritual ideas in theory while completely misinterpreting their real essence. True understanding demands more than intellectual assent. It requires deep inward reflection, followed by the challenge of embodying those truths in real life. This necessity presents a core problem for anyone trying to convey such truths. When these ideas are presented in a direct and unambiguous way, the audience may accept them at a surface level, without experiencing the interchange they are meant to provoke. In doing so, profound insights can be reduced to clichés or absorbed into societal norms, stripped of their vitality and urgency. Ironically, straightforward explanation can actually hinder genuine understanding, fostering a false sense of knowing. In response, Kierkegaard perfected what he called the art of indirect communication. Instead of presenting conclusions for passive acceptance, this form of communication is crafted to ignite inner questioning, reflection, and ultimately personal commitment. Its purpose is not to inform, but to awaken. Indirect communication disrupts the tendency to treat meaning as merely verbal, pushing the reader instead to internalize the truth and live it out. To accomplish this, the communicator must function as an artist, someone who crafts their message to resist simplistic interpretation and to require thoughtful engagement. This means employing techniques that draw the reader into an active process of interpretation, encouraging them to wrestle with complex ideas and arrive at understanding from within, rather than being handed conclusions from outside. Irony is one of the key tools in Kierkegaard's method. By expressing one thing while subtly suggesting another, irony creates a gap between the literal and the intended meaning. This tension invites and even necessitates interpretation. Through ironic distance, Kierkegaard could highlight the contradictions and shortcomings of popular beliefs without directly attacking them. This approach respected the autonomy of his readers, guiding them without dictating, offering insight without forcing agreement. Perhaps the most intricate element of Kierkegaard's indirect strategy is his use of pseudonyms. Many of his major works were published under fictitious names, each representing a distinct existential or philosophical viewpoint. This allowed him to explore a range of perspectives in depth, without endorsing any single one as the definitive expression of truth. This technique forces readers to engage critically, sorting through the various arguments to determine which resonate and which do not. By refusing to present a unified authorial voice, Kierkegaard blocks passive acceptance and invites active discernment. Each pseudonym represents not just a theory, but a unique orientation toward life, complete with its internal coherence and inherent limitations. For instance, one pseudonymous author may advocate a life centered on aesthetic enjoyment and immediate pleasure, while another defends ethical responsibility and social commitment. Others confront the challenges of religious faith and spiritual devotion. By exploring these views through fictional voices rather than speaking as himself, Kierkegaard requires his audience to engage with the ideas independently, judging them not by the authority of the author, but by their own inner conviction. This method reflects Kierkegaard's deeper conviction that existential truth cannot be separated from the individual who lives it. Each pseudonym is more than just a narrative device. It embodies a distinct way of being in the world. Their perspectives are inseparable from their character and choices, showing what it means to live out a specific worldview in concrete, personal terms. This synthesis of stylistic innovation and philosophical depth allows readers not only to grasp each philosophical position, but also to see how these ideas unfold when put into practice. Rather than engaging in abstract critique, the internal contradictions and limitations of each perspective are revealed through their vivid, dramatic enactment. Kierkegaard's understanding of irony was profoundly influenced by his deep engagement with Socratic thought. He viewed Socrates as the ideal practitioner of irony, someone who used dialogue not to assert truths, but to expose assumptions and provoke self-reflection. In the spirit of Socrates, Kierkegaard adopted irony and performative expression as tools to question cultural norms and prompt intense introspection. The Socratic approach resists simple answers. It disrupts complacency and forces individuals to scrutinize their most basic convictions. Likewise, Kierkegaard's irony generates a productive disorientation, one that breaks passive habits of thought and invites active, critical engagement. The aim of this indirect mode of communication is not to confuse or mislead, but to foster the conditions for genuine understanding. Direct communication often treats the audience as mere recipients of information, whereas indirect communication draws them into a participatory process of discovery. It honors the truth that the most meaningful insights into human existence cannot be transmitted mechanically. They must be earned through personal struggle, inward questioning, and deliberate commitment. In this framework, the communicator is not a conveyor of absolute answers, but rather a facilitator, someone who, like a midwife, assists others in birthing their own realizations. Kierkegaard made a deliberate distinction between the types of communication appropriate to different kinds of truths. For empirical facts or objective knowledge, clear and direct expression is both suitable and necessary. But when addressing subjective truths, those concerning personal existence, spiritual experience, and individual meaning, indirect communication becomes essential, because such truths engage the entirety of the person, not just their intellect. The form in which truth is communicated must mirror the nature of the truth itself. This is why, for Kierkegaard, writings about existence and religious life must employ artistic and dramatic strategies instead of relying solely on logical argument. His preference for indirect communication stemmed from a deep respect for personal freedom and ethical self-determination. He believed that true faith and authentic living cannot be forced from the outside. They must be discovered and chosen by the individual. To assert religious truth in an overt and conclusive way, Kierkegaard argued, would violate personal freedom by eliminating the ambiguity required for a sincere act of faith. Indirect communication preserves that vital uncertainty, leaving room for individual interpretation, decision, and commitment. This approach has wide-ranging implications beyond philosophy, extending into fields such as education, therapy, and spiritual guidance. Effective teaching or mentoring, in this view, isn't about delivering preset answers. It's about enabling others to uncover meaning through reflective practice and lived experience. The best educators and most powerful authors don't simply instruct, they create the conditions for revelation to occur. Doing so requires an acute sensitivity to context and rhythm, understanding when to clarify and when to let ambiguity speak, when to respond, and when to pose a question that lingers. Kierkegaard's remarkable skill with indirect communication is a key reason why his writings continue to provoke deep, varied, and often intensely personal interpretations. He did not intend to present a complete philosophical system for easy acceptance or rejection. Rather, his works function as invitations, calls to ongoing inquiry and individual exploration. Each reader is challenged to wrestle with the complexities he presents, forming their own conclusions about what these ideas mean and how they apply. In this way, Kierkegaard's legacy remains dynamic and challenging, defying assimilation into rigid academic systems or simplistic doctrinal formulas.